This is Audible.
Thief of Hearts, a novella of the Pruxnae, written by Lucy Varna, narrated by Angel Clark. Chapter 1. Alna Lomig skipped down the stairs leading out of the house of Jakuv onto the busy midday streets of Elaria. The prime city's residents bustled along the wide sidewalks, preparing for that night's celebration. The Queen's Guard was being renewed with fresh-faced candidates straight from their secondary training courses, and Alna would be among them. She forced the excitement bubbling within her down and assumed a sedate pace through the scurrying throngs. The Jakuv were elegant, refined, dignified. They didn't dance in the streets or scream their joy into the air, no matter what the cause of their happiness. Had Mother Jakuv herself not instructed Alna as to the proper decorum? Had it not been reinforced during years of training and practice, years spent away from home among the sisters Mother Jakuv had hand-selected for membership in the prestigious house? Years of study now bearing fruit in the opportunities presented to Alna. She paused in front of a statuette of the goddess Ji and offered gratitude for the honor bestowed upon her, and for the sacrifices her parents had endured on her behalf. Her fingers touched the Jakuvian crests pinned to the shoulders of her uniform, holding her ceremonial capelet in place. Not every child presented to a house was accepted, even when her family could afford the requisite bribes to ease her path. "Alna!" Alna whirled and spotted Sister Crati Flenig, and grinned in spite of her good intentions, mirroring the smile dancing on Crati's wide mouth and in her black eyes. They met in the middle of the street and clutched each other's elbows, tall warrior maidens equally matched. Alna touched her forehead to Crati's. "Tell me you made it." "No thanks to your mischief." "My mischief? I wasn't the one who snuck a kiki into Mother's bedchambers." "It wasn't poisonous. Besides, you dared me." "I dared you to ruffle the maiden's feathers, not set a lizard loose on them." Alna eased away from her friend and tilted her head toward the bridge leading out of the city proper. "To the market?" "Yes, I'm dying to celebrate." "You mean flirt?" "That too," Crati said, her smooth voice filled with humor. She hooked her arm through Alna's and matched her pace. "Don't tell me you're not eager to try your new status out on the jockneys." "Only if they're handsome. I swear, if one more weak-chinned elitist fop approaches me, I'm going to put my training to good use and break his kneecap." Crati slid a coy glance at Alna out of the corners of her dark eyes. When she spoke, her words were tinged with Mother Jakuv's rounded, aristocratic tones. "Darling, it is your duty to breed with the elite and propagate the next generation of guards." "If Mother wishes us to breed guards, she'd be better off sending us to the jockneys." "Too true." They wended their way down the sidewalks past festooned houses and shops, through the massive gates protecting the inner city, then across the bridge into the open-air market cushioning the residents from the port on Elaria's outskirts. Here the people were relaxed, friendly. There was no stiffness or formality, no protocol to follow or rules to obey. Merely shoppers and stall-keepers haggling their way toward a mutually beneficial trade. Crati pulled Alna to a halt in front of a cloth merchant's stall. The jockney manning it winked at her and subtly flexed his biceps, bared by the simple leather vest he wore over a sleeveless gray tunic. Flirtatious Crati winked back. "What goods today, Master Trader?" "Only the finest for the house of Jakuv and her aspiring candidates." "Aspiring no longer. We fill the Queen's Guard on the morrow." The jockney's pale eyebrows arched toward his trader's cap. "And whose bed do you fill tonight?" Crati grinned. "Maybe yours." Alna rolled her eyes and guided a reluctant Crati away from the stall. Our first night as a free woman, and you already have an offer? How do you do it? By opening myself to the grand promises of the universe. You should try it sometime. I'd rather eat a kiki. The lively strains of music drifted to them from deeper within the market. Krati snagged Alna's hand, and together they raced through the growing crowd toward the stage. As they passed a flower stall, a man stepped into Alna's path, too quickly for her to avoid. She stumbled into his hard strength and rebounded away from him, and in the process lost her grip on Krati. Gloved hands shot out, catching her arms, and the man steadied her. "Careful," he said. Alna jerked her eyes up and met the brown-gold gaze of her savior. His eyes were warm above the black, homespun cloth covering the lower half of his face, hidden in the shadows of his hooded cloak. He was broad of shoulders and long of leg, and held himself with the arrogance of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. Her heart skipped a beat and settled into a fast gallop. A Pruxnae, in the flesh. She'd lay odds on it. Of all the men for her to run into on her first night of freedom, she had to pick a woman-stealing brigand. She eased away from him as politely as she could, and succeeded only in loosening his hold on her. His hands slid down her arms and caught hers in a firm grip, and his slanted eyes crinkled at the corners, as if he were smiling under the cloth hiding his features. She cleared her throat and tugged gently on her hands. "My apologies, good sir." "My lady." He bowed and pressed the backs of her hands against his forehead. "I'd always heard the women of Zinad were beautiful, but I never believed it until I saw you." A woman-stealing brigand and a flatterer? Just her luck. "If you'll excuse me, I'm expected elsewhere." He straightened to his full height, a full head taller than her. "By a man?" "By a friend," she said evenly. "Good day." She slipped out of his grasp and lost herself in the crowd. The skin on the nape of her neck tingled, the instincts of someone being watched. But when she turned around, the Pruxnae was gone. Disappointment sighed out of her on a long exhale. Oh well, it was better not to attract a Pruxnae's attention anyway. They had a nasty habit of stealing women whenever they pleased, whether the women wanted to be stolen or not. And she had a life to live, beginning first thing on the morrow. Alna smoothed her uniform down over the nerves fluttering in her stomach and stretched her neck around the gawkers blocking her view of the musicians playing on the central stage. Krati had to be around here somewhere. She'd be tickled by Alna's run-in with the Pruxnae, if she hadn't already paired off with a handsome jockney. Good thing the Pruxnae had already disappeared. Otherwise, Krati would throw Alna into his path at every opportunity, and no telling what trouble that would bring. Garid ab Einif eased into the scant shadows behind the flower stall and tracked the woman's progress into the heart of the market. He hadn't lied about her beauty. She was tall and willowy, strong and elegant of limb. Long blonde curls flowed down her strong back, and her eyes were the exact shade of Abu's bluest oceans. A deep intelligence glimmered out of those eyes, modulated by the athletic grace and the innate politeness of a woman entrenched in the upper echelon of Banamian society, Zinad's most powerful nation. Curiosity stirred, and with it the warmth of interest. He hadn't lied about her beauty, no. But even it wouldn't have swayed him if it hadn't been paired with the shy pleasure adorning her expression. She found him attractive. Coming from a stiff-necked Banamian, it was the highest of compliments, and more than enough to deserve a second glance. Rightim slipped up behind him and jerked his scarf-covered chin toward the woman. "A conquest already, brother." "A consideration. What do you think?" "She's pretty enough. A bit skinny for my tastes." Gared snorted out a laugh. I don't want to win you for a wife. Ah, but they're sturdy creatures. Shaggy, true, but that's not an obstacle for a man of your talents. The horns would be, Gared said dryly. I'd rather not be skewered. Then you shouldn't court a Banamian. Rightim clapped a heavy hand to Gared's shoulder. Or anyone else on Zinod for that matter. Think of what waits us on Agren. Soft, docile women who enjoy having a man between their thighs. You could have your pick. Or he could stay on Zinod and investigate the beauty whose path he'd stepped into. When Rightim had coaxed Gared into accompanying him to Agren for a semi-centennial raid, Gared had gone along merely to stave off boredom. At 24, he was too young for a wife and the responsibilities that came with having a family. He had years yet before he had to worry about that. Years of building his holdings and acquiring enough vood to please even the prickliest woman. Like, say, the one now talking with the friend she'd been in such a hurry to meet. An ebony-skinned woman wearing a similar capelet over a crisp white uniform. Not a man, then. Was the woman yet unpaired? Or was she meeting her man later on, once Zinon's sun sank below the horizon and darkness enveloped the city? If she was unpaired, would she be willing to consider him as a match? A woman like that could survive the rigors of life on Abu. She could withstand the challenges of a land locked in snow and ice for half the year. And she might even be strong enough to give him the one thing he'd always wanted. He studied her from beneath the shadows of his hooded coat, considering possibilities, and a ray of hope for something he'd never thought to have ignited in his gut. Maybe it was time to rethink his position on taking a wife. Raiding season is always open on Zinod, Gared murmured. They like the challenge, Rightim said. They think they can outwit us or some such nonsense. Like we haven't figured out a way to counter their security measures and smuggle our treasure off planet. A Pruxnae always gets his woman. And you want her? Gared shrugged. Can you spare the time for a dance and a light flirt? For those? Always. I'll even do you the favor of distracting her friend. Gared cut a side-eyed glance at his brother and grinned. I don't know, Rightim. She's a little scrawny for you. Save your humor for the woman, brother. Rightim leaned close and muttered. I think you're going to need it. Maybe so. And maybe the woman would be of no interest once Gared had coaxed her into spending time with him. He dug local currency out of the pocket on the inside of his coat. A suitor bearing gifts was more likely to be received, and he wanted to witness the woman's pleasure again. Among other things. Chapter 2. Alna forced herself to focus on the musicians, on Krates' excited chatter, on the crowd around her. Anywhere but on her fleeting encounter with the Pruxnae. He was long gone by now, likely on one of those infernal raids where he'd steal a wife to help him populate his accursed race. And good riddance to him. She twisted the fingers of her free hand into the hem of her uniform tunic. The least he could have done was told her his name. Krates' hand tightened on hers. If you want to go after him, then go. There's no shame in wanting a man, Alna. I have no idea what you're talking about. Right. That's why you're peeking over your shoulder every other moment and worrying a hole in your uniform. Alna dropped her free hand to her side. I'm merely concerned that he might have been hurt when I ran into him. Is that it, then? You're concerned? Krates' mouth twitched at the corners. I never thought I'd see the day when you were this concerned over a man. A reluctant smile tugged at Alna's mouth. Oh, stop. When you admit you're attracted to him, I don't even know his name. So, chase him down and find out. Alna rolled her eyes. Sure, I'll just hop on the nearest outbound ship and jump over to Abu. Mother Jakub will kill me. Mother Jakub, Prati said firmly, will understand what it's like to be young and in lust. She's a woman too, you know. Alna had her doubts about that. The stern matriarch of the house of Jakub wasn't known for her understanding nature, and though Mother had offspring, no one had actually ever witnessed her in the presence of a fertile man. Speaking of lust, Prati murmured, that's my cue. Her hand slipped out of Alna's and she faded into the crowd, led by a massive man wearing clothing suspiciously similar to the Pruxnae Alna had run into on her way to the stage. A broad hand slid under Alna's arm and pulled her against a solid male body. Another appeared in front of her, holding a single bloom of a rare blue trilily. This reminded me of your eyes. The nerves in Alna's stomach jumped and pinged, and warmth settled low in her gut. Oh. Allow me the honor of braiding it into your hair, lady warrior. She risked a peek over her shoulder, up into the Pruxnae's warm eyes. I don't have anything to secure it in place. I do. No tracking devices? His eyes crinkled at the corners. A gift is not a gift if it hides an ulterior motive. Do you have an ulterior motive? I might. Here. He skimmed a gloved finger over her jaw, turning her face away from him. Cloth rustled, then his fingers threaded through her hair, twisting it around the stem of the delicate trilily. A moment later, he cupped her shoulders and brushed his scarf-covered mouth against her ear. Beautiful. The word shivered through her, stirring the heat gathering in her blood. Thank you. Dance with me. Oh, no, His hand slid around her, one on her stomach, the other down her arm, and his fingers tangled together with hers. Just one. The husky pleading was her undoing. She leaned against him, her back to his chest, and allowed him to guide her in a slow, whirling dance through the frenetic crowd. Music washed over them, vibrant and electric, and the aroma of freshly baked treats wafted through the air. Alna closed her eyes and reveled in the contact, in the strength of his touch and the sureness of his steps, in the slide of his skin against hers. Her eyes flew open and she stumbled to a halt. You took off your gloves. I don't wear them all the time. She ignored the mild humor in his voice and swiveled around in his embrace. I want to see your face. Not yet, beauty. When? Soon. Another dance. She narrowed her eyes at him. You're trying to seduce me. That depends. On what? On whether or not it's working. He nodded at something over her shoulder. Look. She turned around and faced the sunset, blooming in rich pinks and golds across the horizon, beyond the city's carefully shielded perimeter and the lush jungle surrounding Alaria. The Pruxnae had somehow managed to maneuver them to a rail encircling the market, separating it from a high drop into the river Mikto and the dense foliage of the jungle beyond. The view there was magical and unreal, like her time with the man who'd snared her interest with the simplest of gestures. If only he weren't a twice-cursed Pruxnae. Alna gripped the metal rail with stiff fingers as her companion surrounded her with his presence. At least tell me your name. I have no name in this place, beauty, he murmured. I am simply yours. Her resolve melted a fraction. How could she hold out against his charm? What do you want from me? The warmth of your touch. A span of time spent however you wish. A kiss, She sucked in a breath. Blessed G, he was trying to seduce her, and it was working. I have my duties, Pruxnae.
Not on this night, surely.
On the morrow, she admitted reluctantly.
Then allow me this time to plead my suit.
How do I know you won't try to kidnap me? He nuzzled her neck, a gentle scrape of his covering across her sensitive flesh.
I vow not to steal you from your home before our first kiss. Does that settle your mind?
Somehow it did. She relaxed and flashed a smile at him over her shoulder. Another dance?
Anything you desire, beauty.
He led her into the celebrating throng as shadows stretched across the city, and they danced under the rising moons and the stars glittering one by one into the night.
Nothing stirred in the house of Jakuv. No sisters roamed the halls, headed toward training or class. No guards patrolled the interior during the still of deep night. Even the shadows were silent, a testament to Mother Jakuv's ability to secure the massive, multi-layered complex housing her wards. Garid snuck a quick glance around a corner and marveled at the corridor's emptiness. Banamians were an arrogant lot, confident in their skills as warriors, but even they couldn't be idiotic enough to believe their security was impenetrable. It had been easy enough to slip past the guards into the candidates' quarters toward the beacon emitted by the tiny chip he'd planted in the woman's capelet. Not on the flower he'd given her. He'd been completely honest there. A man starting a relationship on a lie might as well give up. He'd never earn his woman's trust. Garid had already made the decision to keep the lovely lady warrior, and wouldn't have lied to her anyway. Trick her, bemuse her, make mischief in the hopes of earning a smile, yes. Lie to her? Never. It had taken hours to send Rightim on his way and make arrangements for a prolonged stay on Zinad, well out of reach of the formidable Queen's Guard and Mother Jakuv's certain wrath. Now all Garid had to do was entice the woman to come with him. And if that didn't work, he had a backup plan, a just in case he hoped wouldn't be necessary. He checked the corridor again, discerned no movement, then slipped into the dim light emitted from glow bulbs placed at regular intervals down the hallway. His booted feet were silent on the tiled floors, his breaths a bare whisper as he followed the beacon to its origin point with the handheld tracker he carried. It led him to a nondescript door exactly like every other door he'd passed in the corridor. He tucked the tracker into his coat pocket, inhaled a fortifying breath, and knocked softly. "Beauty," he whispered. "Are you awake?" On the other side of the door, footsteps slapped onto the floor in a rapid patter. The door was yanked open, a firm hand wrapped itself around his wrist, and he was jerked into the shadowed room. The woman shut the door and pressed her back against it. Her thin strapped shirt clung to her upper body, outlining her full breasts, and fell to her waist above minuscule underwear and the long length of her shapely legs. She shoved blonde curls out of her face and glared at him. "What are you doing here, Pruxnae?" "I came for the kiss you promised me." "I promised no such thing," she hissed. "Didn't you, when you made me promise not to steal you away?" He shrugged his coat off and folded it onto the sturdy metal trunk placed at the foot of her narrow bed, scarcely more than a cot. "I'm here to collect my reward for good behavior." "Put that back on. You're not staying." He tugged one end of the scarf covering his hair and the lower half of his face away from his neck. "Then why did you open the door?" "Because men aren't allowed inside a sister's quarters. You, Pruxnae?" "Yet here I am." He unwound the scarf and dropped it onto his coat. "You wanted to know my face. I wish to know your name." She held one hand out and shook her head.
"Oh no, I know this game. First you seduce me with your sweet words and kind gestures. Then you sneak into my home and coax me into telling you all my secrets. The next thing I know, I'm hidden away in the cargo hold of a kiki-infested junker on my way to Abu for the choosing. No thanks. I'm happy right where I am."
He laughed softly. Such cynicism from such a beautiful woman. "Wrightim will be disappointed to hear your opinion of his ship."
"Who's Wrightim?"
"My brother. He's on his way to a raid." The woman's eyes narrowed into hot blue slits.
"I knew it!"
Gared eased forward a step, careful to keep his gesture small. "Note that I'm still here, not participating in a raid."
"Because you're trying to kidnap me instead."
He clucked his tongue and edged closer to her. "Are all Queen's guards as distrustful as you?" Her hand dropped to her side, thudding lightly into the door, and her eyes widened.
"How did you know about that?"
"The crest on your shoulders earlier. The uniform you were wearing." He crossed the final distance between them and cupped her face, tilting it up to his. "The joy in everything you did tonight. When will you be inducted?"
"After first light."
Her gaze dropped to his mouth and her tongue flicked out, touching the center of her curved upper lip.
"It's a great honor to be chosen."
"The highest," he murmured. "A kiss, then, to celebrate the warrior you'll become. Just one."
"That's what you said about the dance."
He kissed her then, silencing her objections, a fleeting taste of her supple lips. The simple touch jolted through him, turning the heat of her presence into a consuming thirst for more. "Tell me your name."
"You first."
"Gared ab Einif of Abu."
"Alna Lomig, forever of the house Jakuv."
Her fingers curled into the neck of his tunic, and she rose on her tiptoes, aligning their bodies.
"That wasn't much of a kiss."
"You wish another?"
"Please,"
she whispered, and he was helpless to deny her. He cupped her nape and kissed her again, open-mouthed, greedy, demanding a response equal to the need she stirred so easily within him. It roared through him with every slide of her mouth under his, with every flick of her tongue against his lips, with every needy mule issuing from the slender column of her throat, culminating in a burning ache so fierce it threatened to slip out of his control. He jerked his mouth away from hers and buried his face in her neck, panting harsh breaths across her silken skin. "Alna, beauty, have you ever lain with a man?" Her fingers tightened in his tunic.
"No, not as... no."
He squeezed his eyes shut and struggled to regain control of his raging need. Chornen's hammer. To be the first man to claim her passion. The first to stoke it and ride the crest of her pleasure. Yes, he wanted that, as fiercely as he wanted her. How could he wish it to be otherwise? But not tonight. Not when her distrust was so plain and was, at that very moment, in the process of being well-deserved. He reined in his desire, quieting it, and eased away from her. "Let me sleep beside you tonight."
"Sleep?"
"Only that. I vow." Her lips tightened into a thin slash across her face, and she glanced away from him.
"It can never go beyond that."
He turned her face toward his, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I refuse to consider any alternative other than having you in my life. Mark my words, Alna. You will be mine." Her eyes flashed hot in the shadows.
"A bold declaration from a cowardly thief."
Her words meant nothing to him. The Pruxnae had a long and proud heritage as raiders, and were accustomed to having their collective reputation thrown back at them. The snide tone she'd used, though, was another matter. It wormed its way past his defenses into his tender heart, drawing blood, drowning out the need thrumming through his veins. He backed slowly away from her. "Is that what you think of me, Beauty?"
She swallowed hard. "I shouldn't have said that."
"Why not? I'm certainly a thief, as my father was before me, and his father, and so on, back into legend and myth. But I'm not a coward. Never think that of me." He grasped the hem of his tunic and stripped it off, then dropped it on top of his coat, baring his torso to her gaze. Her fingers touched her heart through her thin shirt.
"What are you doing?"
"Getting ready for bed. What does it look like?" He sat down on the end of her cot and unlaced his boots. "Which side do you want?" A startled laugh sputtered out of her.
"There's barely enough room for one, and you want me to pick a side?"
"We'll make do." He tugged his boots off, set them aside. "Against the wall, yes or no?"
"The wall," she said promptly. "Then if your hands roam, I can push you off my bed and teach you a lesson in manners, Pruxnae."
"Garred," he said mildly, and stood, stripping his breeches off in one smooth shove. She squawked, and her vivid blue eyes went round.
"You're naked."
"That's the way I usually sleep. Are you ready?"
She pointed toward an open doorway on her left, though her gaze was pinned on the rigid evidence of his desire. "Need a moment."
"Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." She scurried into the other room and shut the door behind herself, and he grinned. She might think him a cowardly thief, but she wanted him. If her kiss hadn't been enough to convince him, the way she'd looked at him was. And that was all the impetus he needed to set his plans in motion. Coaxing his hard-headed Banamian into leaving voluntarily was obviously out, but it wasn't his only option. He checked his inner coat pocket, palmed his backup plan, and tucked it under the mattress within easy reach. By daylight, his beauty would be exactly where he wanted her, and she would have no recourse but to accept him precisely the way he was.
Chapter 3. A steady croaking woke Alna. It began on a low moan, worked its way steadily upward in pitch and volume, and finally erupted in a loud belch not 2 arm spans away from her aching head. She risked cracking one eye open, and her breath froze in her lungs. A scaly cos was coiled around a sapling, preparing to strike, its unblinking eyes focused on her. A hard arm tightened around her waist.
"Relax, Beauty. It can't see us."
"It's right there." She breathed out the words in a whisper so faint it barely dented the air around them. "And it's deadly fast." Garred flicked a fingertip toward the cos. The space he'd touched bounced out, then in, and ripples undulated in soft rings away from it. The cos jerked back and crawled slowly away. Then Garred settled down behind her.
"There,"
he said.
"Happy?"
A slow panic crept through her, winding its way around her heart the same way the cos had clung to its sapling. "Where are we?"
"If I tell you that, you'll know how to get back to Ilaria."
He yawned into her hair and tucked her closer into the cradle of his huge body.
"Now go back to sleep. It's barely daylight out."
Daylight on the morning of her first day with the Queen's Guard. Her with an aching head, Garred's arm around her, holding her in place in an undisclosed location that was clearly not within the grounds of the House of Jakuv. Alna closed her eyes and swallowed down the bitterness coating her throat. What have you done?
I stole you, like the thief I am. Relax, beauty. I left a note.
You left a note, she said flatly.
Yes, it said, "A handsome thief stole my heart. Wish me well."
The swift burn of anger stole her breath. How could you? He rose above her and stroked tender fingers down her cheek, his forehead knit into a concerned frown above the straight lines of his nose.
I only meant to make light of it.
Make light? Really? She jerked her head to the side, away from his touch. That position means everything to me, everything to my family. They sacrificed so much to place me there, in the most prestigious house in Banam, and you jest? When the queen finds out, she'll place a bounty on my head and my sisters will be forced to fulfill it.
Alna, please.
No, don't you understand? They won't stop until I'm dead, and you with me. She lifted her hands, intending to massage her aching temples, and drew up short. Her gaze fell on the metal encasing her wrists, the chains leading from them over the side of the bed she and Garid rested on, and any hope she had of returning to Ilaria and explaining the whole mess to Mother Jakuv withered and died. You chained me?
So you wouldn't escape while I was sleeping.
Garid cupped her cheeks between his calloused hands and rubbed his thumbs over tears she hadn't even noticed, drying them.
They know your leaving was involuntary. They won't blame you for it.
Then let me go. Let me reclaim my honor and justify my family's faith in me. He eased away from her, and his expression, so open before, shuddered and hardened into an impassive mask.
I'm not letting you go. Not now. Not ever.
The finality of his words sealed her own determination. Then you leave me no choice. I will escape.
So be it.
He slid off the bed and strode away from her, the muscles of his nude body flexing with every even stride.
I'll fix the first meal. You'll need your strength if you really want to escape.
She thumped the back of her head into the pillow and stared at the sky slowly lightening above her. A sick knot gathered in her stomach, edging out the panic and fear. Alna had allowed Garid into her life, knowing what he was. Mother Jakuv would not be as forgiving as he believed, once she learned that. The queen's justice would lash out, unhesitating in its rush to judge, and nothing would be left of the life Alna had struggled to create for herself among the sisters who would now hunt her down. While Garid was out of sight, Alna studied her surroundings. The lightweight bed she lay on was placed on one side of a circular area, defined by a ring of metal clamps, set at regular intervals on top of a stone-tiled patio. The stone extended past the clamps and disappeared in and out of view, under a patchy layer of black loamy dirt. She wiggled upright and touched a toe to the stone beneath the bed. Instead of the cool rigidity she'd expected to feel, it gave way slightly under the pressure she exerted. She glanced around, noted the barely visible shimmer of the air between her and the surrounding jungle shading their shelter, and hummed out her surprise. A biodome, similar to the one protecting Ilaria and other Zenadian settlements from predatory life forms. This one appeared to be portable and had been adapted to fit together with another biodome, unless she'd missed the mark with her assessment. Otherwise, Garid had walked outside to prepare a meal, pure suicide considering where they were. Other than what was visible through the doorway he'd disappeared into, the adjoining biodome was invisible. She shifted around on the bed and gingerly poked a finger into the space where Garid had done the same. It bounced out and in. Ripples appeared in the air, disrupting the slight shimmer. When the ripples had completely disappeared, she moved her finger up an arm span and poked again, and observed the ripples moving around her. Yes, they were in a biodome of some kind, though none she'd ever encountered before.
Touching the shield surrounding Ilaria resulted in a shock no matter which side of it one stood on. Here she felt only the give of the dome's underlying structure. It was a clever adaptation. "Careful," Guard said. "If you push too hard, you'll disrupt the outer shell's energy field." Alna whirled around. "Where did you get this biodome?" "It's a Pruxnae customization. Standard equipment on our ships." "It's proprietary technology." "Only part of it." He held up one of the steaming plastine bowls he carried. "Hot cereal with dried fruit. It's not much, but it should fill your belly." "Thank you." His stride was loose as he crossed the room. He'd pulled on breeches, though he was still bare of foot and chest, and his smooth tanned skin gleamed in the steadily brightening day. His dark blonde hair hung in disheveled curls around his rectangular face, and his strong jaw was stubbled. Forbidden heat thrummed through her, burning into her blood, and she glanced away. Underneath that handsome exterior beat the heart of a betrayer. It was better to focus on that than to allow his allure to sway her from her as-yet unformed plans for escape. He sat down beside her and handed her a bowl. "There's a waterfall nearby, if you want a bath." "I'm not walking into the jungle just to be clean." "It's within the ruins. Safe enough for our purposes." She jerked her gaze to his. "Ruins?" "A temple, maybe. Seemed the best place to set up camp." Alna reassessed the stone floor. The hexagonal tiles fit together perfectly and were, as far as she could tell, as level as the day they'd been laid. Against her better judgment, excitement joined the heat zinging through her. She stirred her cereal as she pondered the possibilities. Zinod's history had always fascinated her, from the Great Migration out of origin space to the first human settlers landing on the treacherous planet. She'd always wanted to explore Zinod's surface, searching for remnants of past civilizations. Would she have that opportunity now? More importantly, would identifying the ruins help her pinpoint where she was so that, when the time came, she could escape Garid and return to her life in Ilaria? "I sweetened the cereal," he said. "That's all that's in it." She snorted. "You kidnapped me. Drugged me." "It was a harmless sedative." "Chained me to your bed in the middle of a jungle full of poisonous predators." "We're in a biodome." "And you expect me to believe you're not out to harm me?" He huffed out a sigh. "You know why you're here." "You want to wed and bed me, not necessarily in that order." She thunked her bowl onto one thigh. "Tell me, Garid, how long before you force me into sex? Tonight? Tomorrow? As soon as you've fed me?" His thick eyebrows snapped down over a thunderous expression. "I'm not going to rape you." "By Vode, Alna, what have I done to justify that accusation?" She leaned forward and speared him with a hot gaze of her own. "You kidnapped me!" "That's the way a Pruxnae woos his bride. Did you truly expect something different when you accepted my gift?" "I accepted a flower and a dance, and—" She cast around, searching for another underhanded manipulation on his part, and landed on the perfect one. "And charming conversation." "You accepted those knowing what I am." "You said you wouldn't steal me away. Swore it, in fact. And yet here we are." His eyes narrowed and he set his bowl down on the floor beside the bed. "Yes, here we are. Two people who are attracted to each other, alone in the middle of the jungle. How are we going to spend all the time we have while waiting for my brother to come back for us?" She held up her free hand, warding him off. "Oh no, you said you wouldn't rape me." "It's not rape if you're willing." He tugged her bowl gently out of her hand and set it aside. Lightning fast, he launched himself toward her, pushed her back onto the bed, and covered her struggling body with his. She punched at him, kneed him,
kicked and wiggled and squirmed, and in the end, managed only to wind herself. He countered every one of her offensive efforts with casual ease and pinned her hands above her head. His mouth brushed her ear.
"Before you try that again, maybe you should know something."
She sucked in a breath and ignored the way their bodies aligned, the press of his stomach into hers, the hard length of his manhood sliding against her sex through the thin layers of their clothing. Oddly, she wasn't scared of him or his arousal, but blessed G, his skin felt a little too good where it met hers.
"What?" she asked. "I was trained by a Banamian warrior."
Alna rolled her hips against his, trying to dislodge him, and he dropped his full weight on top of her.
"She taught me and my brother her language, taught us how to fight, and she taught us every single one of the tricks she learned as a candidate."
Alna stopped struggling. "That's impossible. No Pruxnae has ever successfully stolen a woman from Banam."
He grunted. "Propaganda and misdirection. Can't have the populace knowing how easy it is to steal one of their elite away."
"I'm not an elite. What happened to her?"
"Her husband died in an avalanche. A tragic accident. He was a good man."
Gared's hold on Alna's wrists eased, and he fingered a strand of her hair.
"She disappeared not long after. I always thought she might have come back here, but we've never been able to find her."
Alna lowered her arms and stroked her fingers through the stubble covering his firm jaw. It was too tempting to resist, having Gared so close, and it seemed a shame not to indulge in his presence while she could. "You sound so sad."
"I miss her. She was like a second mother to us."
He sighed, soft and low, and nuzzled her cheek with his mouth.
"We're not a bad people, Alna."
"I'm not a bad person." The unspoken words echoed clearly in the space between them. Alna relaxed under him and rubbed her fingertips into the silky curls spattered across his muscled chest. "How good is that cereal cold?" Gared arched an eyebrow.
"Not very. Why?"
"I wouldn't mind a peek at your waterfall."
"Then the cereal can wait."
He levered himself away from her and pulled her off the bed.
"I brought some of your things. They're in the far cargo crate there."
One of two occupying the space on the other side of the biodome, next to a camp lantern, the only other items in this room of their temporary shelter. "Thank you," she said.
"Gracious to the end."
He jangled the chains holding her cuffed wrists together.
"Can I trust you not to run if I take these off?"
"Until I'm clean and well fed," she promised solemnly.
"Fair enough."
He thumbed the locks on her manacles open and tossed them onto the bed.
"Gather your things. I'll give you a tour before we go."
She rubbed her wrists, soothing the slight sting left behind the metal cuffs. His trust had been given too easily for a man determined to keep his prize. She had a nagging suspicion he was up to something, though what she had no clue. She shrugged it off and rifled through her trunk, noting the items he'd brought. A variety of clothing and shoes, her book of prayers, framed vids of her family and friends, and, oddly enough, her uniform and ceremonial capelet. Her gaze fell on him as he scrounged fresh clothing, and an unfamiliar emotion arose within her. Taking her had been wrong on so many levels, but how could she resist such a thoughtful man? She hardened her heart and focused on her family and the honor inherent in the life they'd chosen for her. Those were too important to risk losing simply because she was attracted to the charming Pruxnae. She'd do well to remember that if she hoped to escape his tender clutches. Chapter 4. Gared led Alna through their shelter, a 3-roomed structure of biodomes interlocked into a rough triangle. Each could be sealed off in case of an emergency.
Maybe he was being overcautious using 3 rooms. Most of the wildlife in the surrounding jungle would be blind and deaf to their presence. If it were just him, he'd risk roughing it in 1 dome. But with Alna along, he couldn't chance it. The 3 domes provided support for each other, strengthening the whole on the off chance an animal strong enough to crush a single dome stumbled upon them. The outer shell's charge should be enough to frighten off everything else. As an added precaution, he'd enabled a floor, ensuring no creepy crawlies could wander in where they weren't wanted, in case his beauty disliked insects. He tangled his fingers through hers, showed her how to arm and disarm one of the outer doors, and set off with her through the overgrown ruins. She seemed fascinated by them. Every stone idol was examined in detail. Every crumbling column earned a revered sigh. They picked their way around tree trunks the width of Gared's shoulders and up the smooth trail set into the side of the cliff, toward the waterfall's midsection. The steps petered out at a windswept rock ledge. Alna dropped the pack containing her fresh clothing and gazed across the jungle's canopy, spread out in front of them in a seemingly endless expanse. It's beautiful. So primitive. You can't even see Ilaria from here. You can at night. The city's lights glow for clicks around. But during the daylight, they're hard to make out. She cut a sly glance at him out of the corners of her brilliant blue eyes. You wouldn't want to point out which direction the city's in, would you? And spoil our fun. He sidled up behind her and wrapped his arms around her. Admit it, you like spending time with me. A thieving betrayer and a dreamer. I'd never betray you. You promised not to kidnap me. Until our first kiss, given well before I took you. Are you going to hold that taking over my head forever? She leaned her head back, meeting his gaze, and she could have sworn he saw humor dancing in her eyes. Yes, of course. I'm a woman. That figured. Did you notice the statue behind the waterfall? A statue? Really? She pried herself out of his arms and scampered to the edge of the waterfall. It fell in an unbroken cascade from nearly 40 keg over their heads onto a rock lip overhanging a stone-lined pool, then spilled over the pool's edge into another waterfall. The stream of water sheltering the pool hit a cavern containing a statue carved into the rock behind the waterfall. Alna dropped to her knees at the edge of the pool and raised her voice over the roar of the waters tumbling down. It's Ji, the mother goddess of the first settlers on Zinad. Legend says she led them here during the Great Migration and protected them as they crafted their new home. Gared knelt beside her. Your people have forgotten this place. We've forgotten many places, Gared. Lost so much in our struggle to survive here. She extended one hand into the water and turned it back and forth in the glimmering sparkles. Only a great tragedy would have forced us from this place. Or a great need. Sometimes need and tragedy walk hand in hand. Her shoulders lifted and fell on a breathy sigh. I suppose you're going to share the pool with me? I'd be a fool not to. He draped an arm around her shoulders and bussed her cheek. The water's pure here. No contaminants, no minute parasites. We can drink from the waterfall if we need to. Are you sure it's safe? I wouldn't let you near it otherwise. He stood and tugged her up and flicked one finger along the hem of her shirt. I'd be happy to help you with that. Cute, but no. He shrugged. Had to try. She grinned and grasped the hem of her shirt in both hands. I would have been disappointed if you hadn't. His own humor rose as she undressed and walked into the shallow pool. Unless he was sadly mistaken, Alna had just flirted with him. He was of a mind to do a little flirting of his own. beginning with admiring the toned strength of her willowy body, up close and personal. The water in the pool was clear and cool under the cavern's concave roof, a perfect antidote to the day's heat. Alna waded into its center through a mild current and faced the statue of Ji. It was huge, easily twice Alna's height. The carved details of the goddess's round features were still crisp after the aeon Ji had sat here, awaiting her people's reverence. Alna clapped her hands together and dipped her fingers 3 times toward Ji, then touched her fingertips to her forehead. "Thank you, Mother Goddess, for the blessings you have bestowed upon us, for your protection and guidance, and for your wisdom." A soft splash near the pool's edge alerted her to Gared's presence, and she smiled. Mother Jakuv might not appreciate the tangles of a woman's heart when tempted by a man like the Pruxnae, but Ji would. She would understand. It was fitting, then, that Gared had brought Alna here, to an ancient temple devoted to the goddess who had led her people to Zinad, and helped them flourish here. Alna turned a coy smile on Gared. "Did I mention that Ji is a fertility goddess?" He scraped a hand over his wet hair and grinned. "You don't say. Care to practice?" She laughed and sliced her hand into the water's surface, shooting a small spray of it toward him. "Your charm won't work on me here, Pruxnae. I am fortified by she who protects." "A worthy shield, lady warrior. If I pray to her, will she grant my wish?" "Only if you repent of your heathenish ways." Alna put her back to the sight of him, deliciously nude with water streaming down the sculpted muscles of his chest, and studied the statue. This must have been a holy place once. "It still is, beauty. Our presence here is no desecration." He slipped up behind her with barely a ripple in the water and wrapped himself around her, pressing his wet skin into hers. "Think of the people who came here to pray to her, those in need of her counsel. The lost and weary, infertile couples begging for a child." His arms tightened around her and his voice dropped to a gruff whisper. "My offer to give you one stands." She closed her eyes against his rough promise, even as she relaxed into his hard strength and the tempting hint of his arousal. "We haven't known each other long enough to have a child together." "It's what comes after the wedding and bedding." "Once a couple has had time to learn each other, yes. We just met yesterday, and already you want to join your life with mine?" "I know what I need to know about you. Your loyalty and humor, your intelligence and wit." She shook her head. "You haven't had a chance to witness any of that." "Haven't I?" He shifted his hold on her and tilted her face toward his. "Have I not had enough time with my brave warrior to learn that she bends without breaking? That her courage is her strength, and her grace the light sustaining her heart? Can I not wish to call her my own? A woman with the endurance and fortitude to bear children sturdy enough to—" He bit the words off and raised shining eyes toward Ji, and understanding flooded through Alna. Whispers of the Pruxnae's predicament had reached even her sheltered ears. Too many of their daughters died at birth, another alarmingly large portion before reaching adolescence. Some blamed it on a mystical and ill-defined curse they'd earned in the long-ago past. Others on the inferiority of their men's DNA. Whatever the cause, the Pruxnae refused to discuss it with outsiders, and so the truth lay buried in Abu's tight-lipped culture. "You believe I can give you a daughter who will live into adulthood," she said. He touched his fingertips to his forehead and lifted them toward Ji. "It is my most fervent wish." "Not to win my heart?" "Your heart is your own, fair warrior, but a daughter's heart is her father's." His expression lightened and humor curved his mouth into a smile. You can have our sons. Would that be enough to bind you to me? If circumstances had been different, it would have tempted her. But that wasn't the path she stood on. Still, she couldn't resist offering him a small measure of comfort, nor could she ignore the lure of his charm. She pressed a small kiss to his smiling lips, then eased out of his reach. I am for the Queen's Guard, thief, well above the likes of you. Though if you beg hard enough, I might allow you to wash my hair. His smile widened into a mischievous grin. So I'm to be your jockney, is that it? We'll see about that, beauty. He surged toward her on a wave of crystal-clear water, and she shrieked and slithered out of his grasp. They played in the waters of the sacred pool, laughing and teasing each other, until thoughts of the future awaiting them were no more than prayers whispered on the wind. Chapter 5. Gared lay with his back on the bed he shared with his beauty, staring at the stars twinkling in the night sky above them. How many worlds do you think are out there? Billions and billions. She shifted her head where it rested on his arm. Imagine the choices humans had during the Great Migration. What drove them to pick one star system over another? To say, here, this is our home eternal. According to you, Xi and the other gods and goddesses. He twined his finger through a strand of her hair draped over his bare chest, admiring the fine texture and the way it curled around his flesh. Thank you for today. I didn't do anything. You shared your holy place with me. You are still here beside me. I was too tired to plot an escape after eluding your pursuit through the water. Satisfaction purred through him. Another hour in the pool and she would have welcomed his attention. It had been there in the way her eyes lingered on him, in the soft touches she dared whenever they were close. I'll have to wear you out like that again tomorrow. You can try. She sighed and toyed with the loose breeches he wore. It's peaceful here. I can't believe no one's tried to reclaim the temple. It's too far from Ilaria. Too hard to hold against nature. Not so hard a determined Pruxnae couldn't manage it. I'm only claiming it for a little while. Just long enough to woo my bride. Her fingers knotted into a fist against his thigh. Even if she's unwilling? Are you, beauty? I am. Not in deeds. You were happy enough today. You're too charming to resist, thief, but I still have my duty. And you intend to return to it? At the soonest opportunity. She turned onto her side, facing him, and rested her hand over the steady thump of his heart. You know I won't give up until I'm free. I'd be disappointed if you did. Something heavy thudded into the ground outside the ruins, shaking the bed. Alna eased onto her back, her gaze turned toward the disturbance. How strong is this biodome? Strong enough. Why? Another thud rattled their supplies. I think we're about to have company. I was afraid you were going to say that. He muttered. Whatever it is, it can't see us. Can it break through the dome? That depends on how big. His voice trailed off as the shadowed vegetation outside the ruins parted, and a humongous reptilian creature stepped into the moon's light, towering above the biodome. Its elongated head capped a short, thick neck, leading into narrow shoulders and a barrel chest. It stood on 4 legs bulging with ropey muscles, ending in flexible clawed paws. Shiny scales covered its hide, overlapping one another, an impenetrable barrier. A pointed tail whipped around, mowing down everything in its path, and whole trees crashed onto the jungle floor in its wake, their man-sized trunks reduced to splinters. Gared sucked in a breath and lowered his voice. Maybe.
That's not reassuring, Garid.
You can yell at me later. What is that thing?
Arigondel, the king of the beasts, a ferocious predator.
Poisonous?
It doesn't have to be. Did you miss the claws?
She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the giant beast.
Too bad you didn't bring my sword.
That isn't a beast you kill with a sword, Alna, no matter how brave you are.
Crazy Banamians and their crowd in honor.
He reached under the bed and groped for the blaster holstered to the underside of the bed's frame, below the mattress. This is what you use against Arigondel.
Has that been under there the whole time?
I snuck it in while you were relieving yourself earlier. And thank Fru for his precaution. Alna held her hand out.
I want one.
Forget it, Beauty. It's bad enough I left you unchained. The Arigondel lowered its head and sniffed the stone floor at the edge of the ruins. Garid stilled. He'd known Zinod had its share of monsters. He just hadn't expected to encounter one. And that's what he got for not taking Ritem's suggestion and leaving with Alna last night. They could have been long gone by now, well away from Zinod and the dangers its jungles threatened. But no, Garid had wanted time with his beauty. Time to woo her. Time to persuade her to his suit with no one else around to distract them. An umlik of days alone in the ruins had seemed romantic when he'd formulated his plan. And it was working. Alna was enamored of the temple's lost history and softening toward him. Too bad the ruins came with a host of nasty beasties. The Arigondel crept toward them, each step a resounding quake vibrating through the ground into the biodome. It poked its nose close to their shelter and tilted its head from side to side, peering through slitted pupils out of unblinking eyelids at the space where Garid and Alna lay.
Uh-oh,
Alna said. It reared back, away from them, then lurched forward, shoving its blunt nose into the biodome a scant keg away from the bed. Alna's body jerked as the energy field flickered and buzzed, and Garid's heart froze in his chest. It could hear them. By Fru, the Crawdon beast could hear them. A distant trumpeting echoed through the jungle. The Arigondel swiveled toward it, standing on its hind legs. Its head wove back and forth in an eerie, boneless undulation. Alna's fingernails dug into Garid's thigh and her body trembled against his. He eased the gun around, pointing it at the temporary dead space in the biodome's energy field, and waited for the Arigondel to decide, them or whatever was calling to it. The call came again. The Arigondel dropped onto all four paws and loped into the jungle along the path it had cleared, disappearing into the night-swept foliage. Alna relaxed her grip on his thigh. That was close. Too close. He holstered the gun and pulled her into his embrace. If anything had happened to her, he would never have forgiven himself. Are you okay?
I'm fine, no thanks to you. Next time, I want the gun.
Hopefully there won't be a next time.
Don't count on it. That was a female. They're territorial and temperamental. Much worse than the males.
A lot like other females. She huffed out a laugh and curled into him, hiding her face in his throat.
If you don't want me, you can always take me back.
I want you, Alna. Never think that I don't. He pressed soft kisses to her forehead, down her cheeks, across her shoulders, and when she turned her face to him, captured her lips with his. She opened for him, welcoming his touch, and he fell into her, mesmerized by the feelings she aroused within him. Admiration, fondness, the first stirrings of an unfamiliar emotion winding its way around his heart. He gentled the kiss and drew back, then tucked her against his chest. Get some rest, Beauty. We have a long day tomorrow.
Yes, frolicking in the pool is dreadful work.
She yawned and draped one slender leg over his.
Thank you for showing me this place.
Any time. Her breaths gradually evened out as he held her and waited for the biodome to recuperate, protecting them from most of Zinod's native fauna. As soon as the sun's leading edge crested the horizon, Guard gathered his tools, disconnected the bedroom third of the biodome from the generator, and examined the section the Arigondol had hit. The outer shell was, in reality, a force field projected by micro-field generators embedded into the metal stakes pinning the hole into the ground. It was supported by an underlying inner shell of two-way camouflaged neoplastine, a flexible, lightweight quasi-fabric often used for temporary shelters. Most of the strength of the biodome came from the outer shell's energy field, interacting with the top layer of the neoplastine. It wasn't meant to withstand a great deal of pressure, and usually didn't need to. Nearly everything was repelled by the shock alone, well before reaching touching distance. That hadn't worked with the Arigondol. Maybe the creature's massive size lent it a certain arrogance where smaller prey was concerned. Or maybe it was too dim-witted to react to a strong shock. The reasons why didn't matter, only that the biodome had come close to failing under the Arigondol's curiosity. Alna came around the side of the biodome wearing a pair of his breeches, a camisole, and her boots, and dropped onto the ruin's dirt-covered stone floor beside him. Any damage? I was about to check. He sorted through his tools, located a diagnostic wand, and ran it slowly around the metal stake closest to him. If these check out and the energy field reforms properly, we can spend the rest of the morning at the pool. Fun, fun. I can fix breakfast. Tired of my cooking already? What cooking? We're eating reconstituted prepackaged meals supplemented with dried fruits and jerky. Nothing but the best, beauty. The wand's display spit out a reading. Guard studied it, then scanned the next stake. There's fresh fruit in there if you're really desperate. Anything's better than that cereal. He grinned. I told you it wasn't good cold. Next time I'll believe you. She stood and brushed off the seat of her breeches. I can stay and help with this. 2 hands are all I need. Besides, I can hear your stomach growling from here. Better my stomach than a kiki. She whirled around and flounced off, chin held at a playful tilt, and Garrett laughed. If you say so, beauty. He watched her until she disappeared into the biodome, admiring the gentle sway of her hips and the swish of unbound curls across her back. His beauty. She was relaxing around him, smiling more, and seemed mostly content with the unplanned turn her life had taken. It was far too soon to hope she'd given up on the idea of escape, but maybe she was beginning to see that life with him wouldn't be so bad, even if it meant letting go of the life she'd hoped to lead. Checking the microfield generators and the underlying neoplastine skin was tedious work. By the time he finished, the sun had risen fully and a sticky humidity filled the air. He gathered his tools and swiped the back of a grime-coated hand across his forehead. A quick breakfast followed by a long dip in the sacred pool sounded heavenly. He pushed himself into a yawning stretch, popping bones as he stood, and eased restless muscles. Alna had had plenty of time to prepare a meal. With any luck, she'd already eaten and could gather their toiletries while he feasted on trail food. He spun out a daydream as he carried his tools into the biodome and restarted the generator. Maybe she'd let him undress her this time, or maybe he could steal a kiss. A man could hope, couldn't he? Especially when her hot eyes had followed his every move yesterday during their time in the pool. Heat zinged through him and his manhood hardened. She wanted him. It wasn't just his imagination. Her need was clearly visible, a potent reminder of the attraction sparking between them with every look, every brush of skin on skin. But he couldn't think about that now, not unless he wanted to frighten her with the strength of his own need. He stalked around the biodome, inspected the area the Arigondel had touched, and ran the diagnostic tool over the now active microfield generators. Everything appeared to work exactly the way it was supposed to. Still, it wouldn't hurt to run some calculations after lunch, measuring their remaining generator fuel against increasing the output of the biodome's protective force field. They still had at least 8 days until Ritem returned, maybe 10. Sneaking into Ilaria for extra supplies might be difficult, though it certainly wasn't impossible. The note Garrod had left in Alna's room had implied that he'd taken her off-planet. No one should be looking for them on Zinad, but that didn't mean he shouldn't exercise due prudence. He stuck his head in the biodome's closest entrance. "Alna, the biodome's repairs are finished." Her tart voice failed to answer him over the rustle of the wind through the jungle and the muted cacophony of animals stirring in its depths. He crossed the first room and peered into the next. This space was their kitchen, the area he'd set aside for food preparation. It was empty, as was the room containing their bed and the cargo crates holding their clothing. A tendril of worry crept into him. Maybe she'd eaten and gone ahead to the pool. Surely she would have told him first, though. Alna wasn't stupid. The jungle was a dangerous place, and she didn't even have a weapon. The thought brought him up short. Quickly he strode through the biodome and checked under the bed. The holster hung there, empty of the gun he'd stored in it for their protection. He bumped the side of his fist against his forehead. Stupid! Of course Alna would go for the gun. She didn't know the Kraden thing was keyed only to him, rendering it useless unless he thumbed the lock over the safety off, which he hadn't, because he wasn't idiotic enough to leave a fully active gun around a trained warrior hell-bent on escaping. The worry blossomed into full-blown fear. Alna was alone in the jungle with only a locked gun and maybe a handful of supplies, if she'd taken the time to prepare. They were easily 50 clicks from the closest settlement. Unless she was an extraordinary navigator, she'd never make it there on her own. Not through a jungle filled with hostile predators, including an irritable female Arigondel. Garrod cursed under his breath and retrieved the handheld tracker. Thank Fru he'd planted a tracking chip in the heel of one of her boots after he'd brought her here, while she was still out from the sedative he'd given her. Otherwise, he'd never find her before danger did. Scratch that. He hoped he'd find her before something worse did, and if not, he hoped he'd get there in time to help her fight it off. He refused to consider the possibility that he might already be too late, that the jungle had taken her before she could even scream for help. He tugged on a shirt, stuffed a medkit into a rucksack along with jerky and 2 canisters of drinking water, then grabbed his backup gun and extra batteries. The blaster had a limited range, but if set to maximum, it could take down nearly everything in its path, maybe even that Kraden Arigondel. He flipped on the tracker and located Alna's beacon on it, then raced into the jungle behind her. She was less than a click away, thank Fru. When he caught up with her, she'd be lucky if he didn't turn her over his knee and paddle her bottom for willingly walking into danger so ill-prepared. Chapter 6. Alna kept one eye on the narrow trail in front of her and the other on the surrounding vegetation. Every once in a while, a reptilian gaze peered at her from under a leaf, or an imprudent creature scampered across her path. Those didn't bother her as much as the noise. Here in the midst of the jungle, the animals were comfortable, unafraid of the intruder in their midst. They called to one another, startlingly loud roars and belches and creaks. Alna's skin crawled as she crept down the trail, nearly feeling her way along it in the scant light, falling through the dense jungle onto its damp floor. It would get brighter. She comforted herself with that fact as she walked, reminding herself that she'd been trained for just this circumstance. Every candidate was. There was always the possibility that the protective shield surrounding Ilaria would fail. It was the Queen's Guard's job to ensure that the city's residents met no harm while the shield was being repaired.
Training had entailed simulated failures and included a day-long hike around the city proper along the outskirts of a jungle exactly like the one she traversed. Of course, then she'd been accompanied by a full complement of other candidates, led by a training commander, and they'd been geared for their mission with armor, weapons, and emergency supplies. Now, it was just her carrying Gared's blaster, a sharp blade she'd scrounged out of the makeshift kitchen, and a canister of drinking water. Too bad she hadn't undergone survival training yet. She stepped over a fallen limb and around a nest of slimy gray eggs on its other side. Maybe she could get credit for her trek through the jungle. It had to count for something, didn't it? At the very least, it proved she hadn't gone willingly with the Pruxnae, even if she'd been tempted for a little while. Surely Mother Jakub would accept that reasoning and mitigate Alna's punishment for abandoning her duty accordingly. On the other hand, it did nothing to stay the punishment awaiting Gared if he was caught. Alna chewed on her lower lip. But he wouldn't be. He was a Pruxnae, wily, resourceful, clever. He'd find a way to wiggle out of any repercussions. Chances were good, though, that he'd be long gone by the time the Queen's Guard located his hideaway in the ancient forgotten ruins. A niggle of something uncomfortable worried at Alna. Not guilt. Of course not. She'd promised not to escape until she was clean and well-fed, and he'd seen to that yesterday, leaving her free to come and go as she pleased. It had been the very act of seeing to her cleanliness that had resulted in her escape. After her and Gared's interlude at G's pool, a glint of metal reflecting sunlight had caught her eye. She'd tracked it visually, observed its irregular pattern as it soared above the jungle's canopy, and determined the aircraft's origin. One of the patrol bases spaced in regular intervals 20 clicks outside of Ilaria. Figuring out its exact location had been harder, but by the time she and Gared had hiked all the way back to the biodome, she'd narrowed the base's likely whereabouts down to a small region. If she could get within a relatively close range, say 2 clicks, she could follow the noise made by the base's routine flights right into the base itself. Or so she'd told herself when she'd formulated her spur-of-the-moment escape plan. Setting it into motion hadn't been all that hard. Gared had let down his guard, a mistake she hadn't expected him to make so soon into her captivity. Maybe she'd played her role too well. She frowned and rolled her shoulders against the idea. Playing a role. No, that was wrong. She didn't have to pretend to like Gared or enjoy their flirtations, or be flattered by the way his brown-gold eyes slid to her when he thought she wasn't looking. He was a hard man to hate. If circumstances had been different, but they weren't. She had her duty on Zinad. He had a life on Abu. A lot of empty space separated the 2 planets. Maybe if he were capable of compromise, but he wasn't. A prudent man would never have jeopardized Alna's career. He would have waited for her to finish her mandatory first tour, maybe offered to settle in Ilaria until she was free of her duties. He would have wooed her the traditional way, with nightly strolls around the house of Jakub's inner courtyard, and sweet treats snuck past the guards. And when he was sure of her heart, he would have approached Mother Jakub and begged permission to wed Alna. Gared had done none of that. The lack spoke volumes about how little he respected her. The trail petered out, ending in a thick stand of coarse-barked Duna saplings. The trunks were no bigger in circumference than her arm. They twisted around one another, forming a massive, impenetrable knot across the path. She scrubbed the inside of one wrist across her sweaty forehead. The edge on the knife she'd stolen would dull long before she felled one trunk, let alone all of them. There had to be a way around this barrier. But where? She glanced left and right, up and down, behind her, and sighed out her frustration. No side trails leapt out at her. Backtracking wasn't a good idea. She'd probably have to spend a night in the jungle as it was. Adding time to her stay here was out. On the other hand, she needed a way to get through the jungle.
She eyed the Duna thicket, followed it to its tallest point, not far beneath the wide limb of a massive willum. That tree's uppermost evergreen leaves disappeared into the canopy, making it an excellent candidate for a viewpoint. Satisfaction zipped through her. See? She could make it here just fine without his charming self's protection. She kicked the lower section of the thicket, then quickly backed up a few paces. Nothing stirred within it. Nothing jumped out at her. No animals squawked a protest or hissed a warning. Just to be safe, she kicked again, backed up, observed her surroundings. Nothing. Some of her tension bled away and she grinned. Yes, she could definitely do this. She tucked her stolen blaster into the thigh pocket of her borrowed pants and grasped two trunks at eye level, ignoring the bite of tough bark into her palms. The toe of her boot fit well into a scant space between some trunks not far off the ground. She heaved herself up, reset her grips, found new toe holes. Up and up she went, climbing carefully, her gaze focused on the strip of thicket above her and not on the ground slowly receding beneath her feet. A third of the way up, a kiki stuck its head through a gap next to her right hand, and Alna shrieked out a startled yelp. It chittered at her, snapping its tiny jaws together like an angry housewife scolding a child for tracking mud across a clean floor. Alna pressed a palm over her racing heartbeat. The poor thing had scared a year off her life, poking at her like that. No worries. A lone kiki was a nuisance, nothing more. She slammed the side of her fist into a Duna trunk near the pest, and it retreated into the safety of the thicket. She resumed her climb, picking her way up her improvised ladder. Her thoughts drifted to Garid. Had he finished checking the biodome yet? Hopefully the Arigandel had done no lasting damage. He still had days until his brother returned, and would need the biodome's shelter even if he didn't stay within the ruins. Which he wouldn't, not with her gone. There was no reason to. Had he noticed her absence yet? That uncomfortable pressure leapt into her chest and she sucked her lower lip into her mouth. What did it matter if he had? She was too far into the jungle for him to catch up to her, too far for him to bother, even if he had a way to track her. She was safely away from him and well on her way to Ilaria, exactly where she should be. Something bit one of her fingers. She yanked her hand away from the trunk she'd been holding and shook the pain out. What was that? Other than the lone kiki, she'd spotted no other creatures during her climb. Her swaying jolts up the thicket should have scared everything else away. Apparently not. She wrapped her palm into the tree trunk she'd just released. The kiki stuck its oblong head out and clicked its teeth together. A second appeared to its left, and a third above it. Uh-oh. A lone kiki was a nuisance, true, but more than one was problematic. The nasty little lizards banded together, and if enough of them were around, could bring down a small squadron of unaware warriors. Maybe she could scare these three away. A handful of other angry heads popped through holes between the tangled trunks, each no bigger than Alna's fist. She cursed under her breath and scrambled down the thicket with far less caution than she'd scaled it. If she was lucky, she could hit the ground before they... Sharp teeth dug into one of her fingers. She glanced up. Nope. They hadn't stayed still, waiting patiently for her to vacate their territory. Oh no, that would have been too easy. Instead, they were swarming out of the thicket above her faster than she could keep track. A whole colony looked like. And wasn't that just her luck? She jumped the remaining distance to the ground and rolled to her feet, drawing the gun as she did. What good it would do. The charge would run out long before the supply of kikis dwindled. But if she could pick off enough of them, maybe she could outrun the rest. She leveled the gun at the nearest one, tracking its movements, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. A sinking feeling dragged her heart in a steady slide into her gut. She whirled around and loped down the trail, dividing her attention between it, the kikis, and the gun. A swift check assured her it was operational. Battery in place. Safety off. She eyed the safety again and swore, long and low. How had she missed the minute fingerprint-activated swipe over the safety? Curse Garrod and his wiliness. She should have known he hadn't truly trusted her enough to leave her alone with an active weapon. All she could do now was run and pray he discovered her absence. Please, let him be on his way to her, preferably with another gun and a handful of extra batteries. A Kiki jumped onto her calf and bit through Garrod's breeches, and she hissed in a breath. Time to get going. She peeled the attacking Kiki off, threw it over her shoulder, and launched into a full-out run, not bothering to look behind herself. The collective mass of Kikis hunting her down was clearly audible as their tiny feet hit the narrow trail, too close to her heels for comfort. It was exactly the incentive she needed to lengthen her stride down the trail, straight toward the man she was trying to escape. Garrod charged into the jungle, unmindful of the noise he made. Alna was out there alone, a target for any blessed thing that needed a tender, juicy meal, and she was on a Crawdon animal trail. And what were those trails used for? That's right, animals of all shapes, sizes, and poisons. He ground his teeth together and jumped down a series of unevenly spaced rock ledges. Escaping him was fine. He'd expected that, had even prepared for it. He'd also expected her to use her ample intelligence, or, Vald forbid, a dose of common sense. One did not run into an unknown territory without a working weapon. She was a trained soldier. She should know that. And yet there she was, a blinking red dot on his tracker, right in the middle of that unknown territory. A distinctly human shriek cut through the jungle, silencing its native residents. Garrod's heart leapt into his throat. Alna. She was hurt, or worse, and there was still a large section of jungle between them. Chornin's hammer. He'd known something would happen to her. He vaulted over a felled tree trunk and raced toward her at top speeds, his arms slicing the air around him, his booted feet churning along the trail. 40 or 50 keg ahead of him, it cut sharply to the right around a large boulder, obscuring his view, but it did nothing to dampen the noise of the stampede headed his way. He couldn't discern the distance between him and it around the wind whipping past his ears, or even what animals were tramping toward him. Was that what had gotten Alna? Had she been caught in a mad rush of animals fleeing from an unknown danger? Alna skidded around the curve, the thieved gun in one hand, a knife in the other. Her eyes were round, her cheeks red, and her breath panted out of her chest in great heaves as she dashed toward him. "Gun!" she screamed. "Get your gun!" He dropped the tracker and lifted his gun, aiming it behind her, and skidded to a stop to one side of the trail, leaving plenty of room for her to run past him. She slowed long enough to grab his arm and shove her useless gun at him. He handed his off to her, thumbed the lock on the one she'd relinquished, and set his stance. The stampede rounded the bend, a herd of creatures no bigger than his forearm in length and breadth. They looked like miniature versions of the Arigondel, with rounder eyes and longer tails, and were covered in rusty scales. Unless they were poisonous, what harm could such small reptiles cause? "That's what got you riled?" he asked, incredulous. "Dangerous groups," she panted. "Need to run." He fired a shot into the point of the herd. Two of the animals tumbled head over heels along the trail and finally settled into limp heaps. Most of their fellow herd members continued around them, undeterred. A handful skittered to a stop and attacked the unmoving lizards, gnawing bits of their flesh with viciously sharp teeth. Right. Run it was. He whirled, grabbed Alna's arm, and shoved her down the trail ahead of him. She was winded good. No telling how far she'd had to run already. Half a click at least, by his estimate, maybe more. If she hadn't been in such good shape, she never would have made it this far. Unfortunately, they still had a long run before they reached the relative safety of the interlocked biodomes, and the voracious herd seemed to be gaining on them. Alna slowed and spun around, her gun lifted as she jogged backward. He ducked to the side, avoiding a rapid spread of energy bursts. High-pitched shrieks erupted from the group. Garrod didn't pause to see what she'd hit. Whatever it was, it hadn't been enough to even slow the creatures pursuing them. He hopped into a run, grabbed Alna's arm as he passed, and tugged her along with him. They catapulted across the downed log, slowing long enough to fire poorly aimed shots across their shoulders, and after another frantic dash, scrambled up the rock ledges. At the top, Alna doubled over and sucked damp, cloying air into her lungs in great heaves. "Need a tick." He glanced over his shoulder. Yeah, that wasn't happening. The herd was at the log. If they'd thinned a mite, he couldn't tell. He grasped Alna's knife-wielding hand and placed it on his bicep, knife and all. "Lead me down the trail while I shoot. It'll give you that tick, maybe." She passed her gun to him and obligingly started walking, guiding him along the trail. He walked backward, firing bright red energy pulses into the determined riot, hitting lizard after lizard, in the hopes of providing fresh meat for their culinary pleasure. It didn't work. The crowd surged forward, abandoning the fallen to the few cannibals in the group, and was soon at the bottom of the series of ledges. Gared pivoted, shoved one of the guns at Alna, and grabbed her hand. "Sorry, beauty. Time's up." She nodded and staggered into a run, picking up her pace as he moved ahead of her, and all but dragged her behind him. They hit the edge of the ruins as the creature's leaders drew within a single keg. Gared tugged Alna's hand, urging her forward, and raced shoulder to shoulder with her across the overgrown tiles. One of the creatures jumped onto her leg and dug its pointy teeth into her flesh through her clothing. She cried out and stumbled, nearly falling in her desperation to slap it off. Other creatures joined in the fray, leaping onto Gared and Alna's legs. He ignored the stinging pain of their bites and reached for the energy he needed to cross the remaining distance between them and safety. Had to reach the biodome. Had to get Alna inside. Sweet, precious Alna. His best hope for the future he yearned to have. He sprinted the last few keg, triggered the entrance, and pushed Alna through it, then punched his fist into the control panel, closing them off. Electric hisses sounded outside as the creatures dove into the biodome's energy field. It flickered and held, and Gared staggered away from the entrance, his relief a faint sigh. By vote, they'd made it, and only just. Something squirmed behind him, and Alna yelled, "Blessed she!" He whirled around and nearly lost his breath. Alna was lying on her back on the floor, wiggling away from him. 3 of the lizards clung to her legs, gnawing through her pants into bleeding flesh. She kicked and smacked them, and screamed, sharp and frightened. It jolted him into action. He scrambled forward and yanked one of the infernal animals off her, twisted its neck, and tossed it aside, then picked the other 2 off. Alna's head thudded into the protected floor. A hysterical laugh escaped her throat, ending in a panted sob. "Thank you." He flopped onto the floor beside her, too winded to care where he fell. "I needed the exercise." She huffed out a breathy laugh and closed her eyes. "Not from my perspective." Something wiggled up his pants leg, scraping sharp teeth over his shin. He sat up, jerked a squirming creature out tail first, and broke its neck. "Crawdon rodents." "Kikis," she said. "They're called kikis." "What did you do to them?" "Tried to climb up their colony's home. If I'd known that's what it was, I would have gone around." And likely encountered something equally ferocious. With a groan, he rolled into a stand and held out a hand to her. "Come on, we need to get those wounds tended." "Yours too," she murmured. She slid her hand into his and pulled herself upright. "Thank you, Gared. Really, if you hadn't come after me." He shushed her with a kiss. So thankful to have her safe and relatively whole, all he could think of was comforting her. "I will always come after you." He pulled her into his embrace and held her. Just held her. He'd almost lost her there. Almost lost himself. What an idiot he'd been to believe they could survive out here for so long, especially knowing how eager she was to leave him. If he could change that, he would. But they were stuck until Rightim fetched his bride and returned for them. In the meantime, their wounds weren't bandaging themselves. He shrugged his rucksack off and retrieved the medkit, and settled down with his lady warrior to tend her as a husband should. Chapter 7. Gard stripped Alna down to her creamy skin. She offered no protests, merely held her heavy hair off her neck and waited patiently while he examined her from head to toe. Her calves had taken the worst of the Kiki's torture. A handful of deep, bloody gouges marred the smooth curves, along with twice that many shallower bites. Her delicately formed hands were scraped raw, and 3 of her bluntly cut fingernails had cracked into the quick. She flipped her hands over in his, examining them. The trail ended in a thicket. I was trying to climb it into the canopy when the Kikis attacked. Did you do this on the way up or down? Maybe both. Duna bark is a little rough. Poisonous? Her eyes dropped. I'm not so ignorant that I'd climb a poisonous plant, Gard. No, you're just ignorant enough to... He bit the words off. Getting angry at her now would only drive a wedge between them, and he didn't want to say something he'd regret later, when his temper cooled. The next time you pick up a weapon, make sure you can actually use it before charging into danger. Kikis aren't poisonous either, but their bites tend to get infected. He sighed, but let her evasion go. I'll apply a topical antibiotic after I clean your wounds. Lie down on your stomach. We'll do your legs first, then your hands. How do you feel about Kiki stew? She wrinkled her aristocratic nose and eased onto their bed, maneuvering carefully onto her stomach. Doesn't sound very appetizing. I'll carry them up to the falls then, and throw them into the jungle, well away from camp. He couldn't resist patting her firm ass and stroking a palm down the smooth curve of her thigh. You have the legs of a runner. Good thing, huh? Her skidding around that curve in a panicked run flashed through his mind, and he shuddered. Yes, it was a good thing she was so athletic. The alternative was unthinkable. He washed her wounds out, sprayed an antibiotic over them, and bandaged them the best he could with the supplies contained in the medkit. The longer he worked on her, the harder fear squeezed his heart. Memory bounced through his mind over and over again, lingering on the worst moments. Alna rounding the corner ahead of at least 50 Kikis. Alna doubled over, struggling to breathe after her lengthy sprint. Alna lying on the floor kicking at the Kikis eating her alive. Nausea roiled in his gut, shooting acidic bile into his throat. She could have been killed out there. Would have if he hadn't noticed she was gone when he had. They'd barely escaped the ravening horde using their combined wits. What could have possibly persuaded her that she could navigate the jungle on her own? Turn over, he said, his voice so thick he scarcely recognized it. She eased onto her side and eyed him. What's wrong? Nothing. Let me see your hands. She sat up and offered them to him, palms up. You're angry? No kidding. He cupped her hands in his, her bleeding hands, scraped raw during her escape attempt. You could have died, Alna. It was a chance I had to take. Why? Nothing is so important that it requires that kind of risk. Her eyes lifted to his, and in their steely depths something hard and determined formed. I have a life in Ilaria, a good one. You stole that from me. Did you think I wouldn't try to get it back? By risking your life? Yes, Gard, she snapped. By risking my life. It was needless, Alna. It was necessary. You could have died. Then I would have died. Her words slapped against him, and he flinched under their impact. Under the steady rancor of her glare and the trembling weight of her hands curling into tight, painful fists in his palms. You'd rather risk dying than stay here with me. Her teeth clicked together. It was her only reaction. No words spilled out of her mouth. The bitterness in her gaze remained unchanged. He dropped onto his haunches and allowed her hands to slide out of his, and the nausea churning in his gut morphed into sick realization. You'd rather die than be with me? He scraped an unsteady hand over his mouth and willed the sickness to stay where it was. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I pushed you to that. If you'd asked me to take you back.
You wouldn't have.
Yes, he would have, if he'd known how she felt, if he'd understood how little he meant to her, that she never intended to soften toward him. What a fool he'd been, seeing what wasn't there, reading false meaning into her actions, clinging to hope when there was none. He staggered to his feet, away from her and the hole she'd ripped through him. Not her fault. He'd taken what he'd wanted, and now he was paying the price, the consequences of a rash, poorly conceived decision on his part. Hope. Amazing what a man would do for a small slice of it. He forced his feet into action, put one in front of the other, moving steadily away from the future he'd hoped to build with her.
Where are you going?
She asked. He grasped at the first reason his muddled brain landed on. The kikis outside are gone. I'll get rid of the dead ones now.
Guard, your legs.
The soft plea was lost on him, blocked by the throbbing wound filling him from stem to stern. One hazy thought prodded him as he gathered the kikis' corpses and left the shelter of the biodome. Her rejection shouldn't hurt like this. It shouldn't consume him after the short time he'd known her. And it shouldn't bring with it the certainty that he'd just lost his only chance at the most important relationship he'd ever have.
Alna stared at the empty space where Guard had been. An awful regret suffocated her, stifling her breath and the anger his irritation had prodded her into.
He'd looked so humbled when he left, with his wide shoulders slumped and his proud head bowed, as if their argument had whittled him down to nothing. She swallowed the sob threatening to escape her throat.
No, not her clever Pruxnae.
A mere woman couldn't dent that thick hide of his. Surely not. What had he said about her? That she bent instead of breaking? She'd thought he was the same. A flexible sapling, giving under the fury of the storm, not cracking at the first roll of thunder. He should have bent. Why hadn't he bent? She pressed trembling fingertips to her lips. Blessed she! What had she done to him? A tear trickled down her cheek through the sweat and grime coating her skin. She scrubbed it away with the back of her wrist. He'd come back soon and they could sort it out. She could explain that... Well, she could explain, and when she returned to Ilaria and he to Abu, they could be friends, couldn't they? Krejci's words drifted through Alna's mind. There's no shame in wanting a man. There was no denying Alna wanted Gared. He had his flaws, his insistence on stealing her against her will being chief among them. But he was a good person, a thoughtful one, and the first man to tempt her into desire. They'd be good together if she could persuade him to wait for her. Patience was a very un-Pruxnae trait, but he'd wait if he really wanted her the way he claimed to, wouldn't he? Yes, of course. She'd work everything out with Mother Jakub. The old woman would forgive young lovers. Even she had to have a heart hidden behind that stern countenance and grim stare. Gared could visit from time to time. They could correspond through the net while Alna finished out the all-important first tour. And then he could court her the way he should have from the beginning, like the honorable man he was. She wrapped that hope around her heart, clinging to it as she cleaned and bandaged her hands, and the sun passed slowly overhead on its journey to the far horizon. Gared hadn't returned by mid-morning, and worry gradually edged out the hope. She'd give him a while longer to regroup, but if he wasn't back soon, she was going after him whether he wanted her to or not. She passed the time with chores, cleaning blood off the oddly soft floor, organizing her clothing, then Gared's. His tools were next, the kitchen area after that. She moved the lightweight bed into the center of its biodome, a far safer position in her mind, and finally fixed herself a simple meal of reconstituted bovie stew. While the stew was heating, she dug out her book of prayers. It fell open to a passage near the middle, marked by an almost dry, faded blue trilily. A smile warmed her through and through. Garrett had tucked the flower he'd given her into the book before he'd packed it for her. The simple gesture said more about him than anything else could have, shoring up her belief in the rightness of her conclusions. She'd talk to him when he returned, get it through that stubborn head of his that she hadn't meant to hurt him, wouldn't have if her own anger hadn't bubbled over, and their burgeoning friendship would weather its first real test. She sniffed the drying flower, savoring its sweet scent mingling with the stew's rich fragrance. That night had been the beginning for them, and now she would always have a reminder. She closed the book, kissed its worn leather cover, and tucked it away again. Garrett would understand, and if he didn't, she'd just have to turn the tables on him and chain him up until he listened. Alma was on the last spoonful of her stew when Garrett entered. His skin was unnaturally pale and haggard under his shaggy mane of hair, and his gaze was flat and dead. A chill shivered down her spine. Whatever he'd done while he was out hadn't helped, and the way he looked now, nothing she said would either. She fortified herself with a deep cleansing breath and tried anyway. "I thought maybe we could talk." He dropped onto the bed beside her, leaving nearly the entire length between them. "I have something to say, then." "All right." "Rightim will be back soon. If you can wait that long to get back to Ilaria, I'll take you myself. I can fix it so everybody knows a Pruxnae kidnapped you." He braced his forearms on his widespread thighs and fixed his gaze on the floor between his firmly planted feet. "If you can't wait that long, I'll escort you to Mother Jakub and turn myself in. Either way, you won't suffer for my sins." "Garrett," she whispered, horrified. "She'll kill you if you confess." "Then she'll kill me," he said flatly. "I'll stay out of your way during the day. You can have the biodome. The ceremonial pool is safe enough." The first flutter of panic rippled through her. "And at night?" "I'll sleep in one of the other rooms or next to a crate. You won't have to fear for your virtue." She hadn't feared for it during their time together, even if she'd goaded him with it yesterday morning. What was a relationship without a good goad or two? "About that." He turned his head sharply away. "Forget it. You've made yourself perfectly clear." "But He stood abruptly, his gaze still locked as far away from her as it could get. "Gather your things. The water in the pool will soothe your wounds." She slid off the bed, silently begging him to look at her, to touch her, to smile or flirt, or anything that would make things right between them. He didn't move, didn't do anything, and the panic morphed into outright fear. She could still fix this, though. She had to. "Let me make you something to eat." "I'm not hungry." "At least let me look at your legs." "They're fine." "But—" He stalked away as if he hadn't heard her, his strides uneven, his footsteps quiet. She sank onto her knees and clutched her bandaged hands to her chest over the numbness stealing through her heart. Her stubborn Pruxnae hadn't bent. He'd broken right in two, pushed beyond his endurance by the awful falsehood she'd allowed him to believe in the frustrated fury that had halted her denial. Chapter 8. Garrett knelt at the edge of the pool, outside the water falling into it. As soon as they'd reached the rock ledge, Alna had undressed and waded into its center, facing the giant statue of Ji. The ends of her long flaxen hair fell into the water's surface, moving with its gentle current as it swirled around her. Otherwise, she was as still as the forgotten idol, stone cold and unforgiving. Maybe he should have given her a chance to speak earlier. She'd wanted to. He just hadn't been able to bear another harsh word from her. Or, worse, a second silence confirming her poor opinion of him. Dying alone in the jungle had been a better option than staying with him. He could keep her, force her to travel with him to Abu and participate in the choosing. He could bind their lives together and get the children he craved on her, and slowly watch the beautiful light fade out of her eyes, ground out under the heel of captivity. No Pruxnae wanted that, least of all Garid. They didn't kidnap their brides to enslave them. The women had to choose freely. They were wooed and charmed and teased into loving the men who'd stolen them, not forced into it by an uncaring culture. That was the Pruxnae way. Always had been, always would be. All the wooing in the world wouldn't coax Alna to love him, though. As the years passed, her laughter would transform into bitter hatred. He couldn't do that to her. It just wasn't in him, and he'd rather give her up than witness the slow rotting death of her soul by his own hand. He shifted on the rock and hissed out a slow breath. The kikis had done as much damage to his legs as they had to hers. It had taken a long time for the pain to penetrate his dazed mind, and even longer for him to distinguish between it and the raw wound Alna had scraped into him. He shoved thoughts of what would happen now out of his head. His path was set, determined from the moment he'd stepped in front of Alna in Alaria's market, intrigued by her graceful stride and the smile lighting her from the inside out. There was no sense in regretting what couldn't be changed, or in wanting her still, or in clinging to the determined spark of hope refusing to diminish inside him. How could he have mistaken her sweet smile as genuine interest? How could he have been so wrong about her? Why in Vode's name did he still care?
Garid?
Her soft voice floated to him above the waterfall's crash. He swiveled toward her, one eyebrow arched. She lifted her bandaged hands, still dry.
I need help getting clean. Do you mind?
Of course not. He shucked his boots, retrieved a sliver of the biodegradable soap, and stepped into the pool. One corner of her mouth turned down.
Aren't you going to undress?
I thought you might feel safer this way.
If I felt threatened by your nudity, I would have said something already.
Her mouth opened, closed, and she cleared her throat.
Besides, I need to look at your legs.
I'll take care of it.
I will do it,
she said through gritted teeth.
Honestly, Garid, is that how you want to spend your life with me? You doing everything while I sit idly by?
I wanted to take care of you, he said gently.
That sort of thing goes both ways.
She waded toward him, slowly rising out of the water. A lithe goddess so beautiful she stole his breath.
Pants off. I'll try to get the blood out. If you have the supplies, maybe we can patch the holes.
He glanced sharply away, stung by her thoughtfulness, come now after she'd rejected him so harshly. It isn't your place to take care of me.
It is if I say so,
she retorted. That tiny thread of hope flared to life, prodded by the firm resolve in her voice, by the undertone he cursed himself for hearing. It made him believe that he could have her, that she wanted him, that the life he'd hoped she'd build with him could still be theirs. Foolish, foolish heart. Still, who was he to argue with her stubborn determination? He undressed while she picked the bandages covering her hands off. Her gaze lifted to him as he stepped into the water, and her frown returned. She abandoned the bandages and eased closer, then skimmed her fingertips over a mark on his inner thigh. So close to his manhood, her fingers brushed its tip. He ground his teeth together. Her light touch was a silky temptation he would have begged for before she'd run from him. And now she offered it freely, when he could do nothing about it. She squinted at the place she stroked in the cavern's cool dimness.
This kiki bite came a little too close.
He huffed out a laugh. Really? It's concerning, she murmured, and her breath feathered over his manhood, warm and moist. Heat skittered through him, and his traitorous body hardened. Alna. His voice was husky, low, and full of the need surging into him. That isn't a good place for you to be right now. It's the perfect place. She straightened and met his gaze, and a tentative smile touched her mouth. When I was little, my parents would argue. Not often, mind you, but they did. And every time, they apologized and made up. When he said nothing, she inhaled a sharp breath and blurted, I'm sorry, Garid. You were right. It was stupid of me to run into the jungle without a fully formed plan. I knew better. I guess I just panicked a little. You were busy and the gun was there, and I knew you couldn't see me through the neoplastine shell. I didn't think I'd get a chance to escape so soon, so I picked the gun up and I left. I knew where I was going. Oh. There are survey stations situated around Ilaria. I was headed toward one. With a gun and a knife. I had water, too. Her gaze dropped to her hands. She fingered the bandage on her left palm. I didn't go there to die. Please believe me, Garid. I just wanted to get back home. So you've said. You don't sound like you believe me. He curled his hands into fists against the need to comfort her. As it wasn't her place to care for him anymore, it was no longer his place to soothe her hurt away, to explain that his belief was irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. When my parents made up, it never went like this. She thrust her hands at him. Here, I can't get these off. He took one hand in his and gently peeled the bandage off, then began working on the other one. He set the used bandages on the lip of the pool and dunked her hands into the water. Have you made a decision on when you want to return to Ilaria? When your brother gets back, if the patrols don't find us first. They won't. I implied that I was taking you off planet right away in that note I left. You really left a note? I really did. Can you wash yourself? Her mouth twisted into a frown. Would you mind washing me so I don't have to touch the soap with my hands? He hissed in a breath. Bathing her yesterday had been sweet torment, and she'd only allowed him to wash her back and shoulders then. How much worse would it be to cleanse her entire body, to memorize every bump and curve of her feminine form, to explore her rich skin at his leisure? She reached for the soap. It's okay. I can do it. No, I will. She'd asked, after all, and even now he didn't have the heart to refuse her. That night, Alna lay on her back in the center of the bed, alone. A storm had moved in before their last meal, obscuring the twilight sky behind heavy black clouds. A gentle rain pattered down around them now, a soothing thrum against the ruined stone floor. But she missed the stars. At least when they were out, she had something to observe. Rain-laden clouds weren't nearly as interesting. She screwed up her courage and said, Are you sure the rain won't short-circuit the biodome? It won't, Garid said. Sometimes it causes havoc with Ilaria's shielding. Ilaria's field generators need to be upgraded. That was probably true. It was simply hard to work on them without turning them completely off, leaving the city vulnerable to attack. She rolled onto her side facing him and tried to distinguish his bulk from the shadows surrounding them. He'd opted to spread a blanket out on the floor where the bed had rested before she'd moved it into the center of the room. Since he'd stretched out there, she hadn't heard a peep of movement coming from the darkened space. I don't mind sharing the bed, she said. So you said. She was beginning to hate that phrase. It was a poor replacement for the sweetly spoken nickname he'd given her. Beauty. She missed hearing it. In fact, she missed a lot of things about him. Things that had abruptly changed after her ill-fated escape attempt that morning. Forget the hand-holding and stolen kisses and cuddling around each other at night while they slept. Except to bathe her and help her navigate the jungle, he hadn't so much as accidentally brushed against her. She flopped onto her back and stared into the night. Her apology hadn't been enough to restore the easy rapport they'd developed. Garrett had retreated into himself, speaking only when he had to, and no more, barely looking at her. And then, his expression was so impassive, even his eyes held no real spark. Longing flooded through her, to have him the way he'd been. Trying to escape had nothing to do with the feeling she was beginning to develop for him. Why couldn't he get it through his stubborn head that she could enjoy being with him and, at the same time, search for a way to return to the Queen's Guard where she belonged? The two weren't mutually exclusive. She opened her mouth to try explaining that to him again, and was interrupted by his softly spoken question. "Do your wounds hurt?" "No," she said. "They're fine. Why?" "You seem restless." "Because things were still wrong between them." "Come to bed, Garrett. Please." He groaned. "You don't know what you're asking." Yes, she absolutely did. "Don't deny me the simple pleasure of your company." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse her again. Then the soft rustle of fabric mingled with the sound of the rain, and he sat down on the edge of the bed. "I can deny you nothing." "Really?" "I wouldn't lie." She groped for him in the darkness and curled her hand over his cloth-covered thigh. "If I ask you something, would you promise to consider it carefully?" "Yes." "Would you make love to me?" "Alna," he said, his voice thin and tight. "You don't want me." Temper sparked, pushing her into truth. "I've wanted you since the moment we met. Nothing's happened to change that." "But you ran from me. You risked dying." "Oh, ease off, Garrett. I wasn't running from you. I was running toward home. If you weren't so thick-skulled, you'd understand that." He sputtered out a laugh. "If this is how you plan on convincing me you want me." "Get down here and kiss me, or I'm going to knock some sense into you the old-fashioned way." She thumped her fist lightly into his thigh, both a warning and a demonstration. "How's that for convincing?" "Good enough. Hold on." The bed creaked as he stood. A moment later, the camp lantern flared to life, casting light across the room. Garrett dimmed it to its lowest setting. He was kneeling beside it, his broad back to her. "Be sure, Alna." "I am," she said softly. "I want this first time to be with someone who cares about me." "There'll be others." "None like you." She scooted over, creating room for him in the narrow bed, and patted the space she'd vacated. She couldn't resist teasing him just a little. "I'll be gentle." "What if I don't want you to be?" "Then I won't. Make love to me, Garrett. Show me what it could be like between us." He stood and turned slowly toward her, his eyes burning brightly and his manhood jutted proudly against the thin fabric of the loose pants he'd worn to sleep in. In 2 steps he was at her side, towering over her, his expression taut and primal. She sat up and hooked her fingers in the waistband of his pants. "I was tempted to taste you this afternoon, there in the pool." "I wouldn't have let you." She jerked startled eyes to his. "Why not?" "You were too vulnerable after what happened. If I'd known how strongly you felt about your duty, if I'd had any idea what you were willing to do." He lifted one shoulder in a half shrug. "I thought you wanted me." He said it almost apologetically, as if he'd committed a sin so great it was unforgivable. Abruptly, her patience snapped. She tugged his pants down and circled her hand around the firm length of his manhood. It was velvet over iron, a thick promise of future pleasure she intended to redeem. "Did you never consider that if I didn't want you, I would have tried harder to escape?" "Alna," he said, his voice husky. "Don't lie. Not now. Not when I have no defenses against you." "I have none against you, thief. You've stolen them all away." She trailed her fingertips along his rigid manhood, over the soft head at its tip. He gasped and clutched her wrist, and a wild satisfaction bloomed deep within her. "Make love to me." "Yes." He covered her hand with his and stroked it over his erection, and he peered at her through hooded eyes. "Will you let me touch you?" "I want you to." In a heartbeat, he pressed her into the bed and sprawled out on top of her, and melded his mouth to hers in a fiercely tender kiss. She threaded her fingers into his curls and held him to her, kissing him deeply, afraid if she let go he'd change his mind. He seemed perilously close to doing so. She refused to let him. It was through his actions that she was trapped here, vulnerable to his charms, and she wanted him, enough to forget her duty for one night, enough to entertain the fantasy that she could be his exactly as he wanted her to be, now, with nothing standing between them and the future he'd wished for. He skimmed a hand down her torso and burrowed under her shirt, cupping her breast in his calloused palm. "Perfect." "I want you there." His mouth curled into a wicked smile. "Soon, beauty." He nipped her earlobe with sharp teeth, and liquid heat swirled in an urgent pull into her groin, firing her blood into a frenzy of need. "You're teasing me." He laughed, low and soft and knowing, and she retaliated, rolling her hips up into his, rubbing her sex against his unyielding arousal through their clothing. He mmm'd and scraped his teeth over her skin, and his fingers tweaked her nipple into a tight peak. Her skin was alive under his touch, a roaring flame, sweet and savage and so good. She bit her lip against the need to plead and writhe and beg him to please her. He yanked up her shirt and sucked her nipple into the moist heat of his mouth, and reason scattered from her mind like dust driven before the wind. She dug her fingers into the hard muscles of his bare back and moaned, "Garrett, please." "Soon, beauty," he whispered. He scattered kisses over her chest, then latched onto her other nipple, suckling her deep into his mouth, and she was helpless under him, lost in a firestorm so fierce and bright she knew only him. She wrapped her legs around his waist and scraped her nails over his skin, and reveled in his low moans and greedy gasps. His fingers delved into her briefs and stroked over her sex, and her hips shot up, sliding against the welcome relief of his touch. "Now, Garrett," she gasped. "I'm begging you. Take me now." His low growl might have been assent, a rough, "Yes, beauty," or an echo of the passion sparking between them. He levered himself off of her, stripped off his pants and her briefs, and stretched out on top of her again. The broad head of his erection prodded her core and slipped inside, and she stiffened at the unexpected invasion. He braced his forearms on either side of her head. "I can stop." "No, please. It was just surprising." She undulated her body against his in an experimental roll of her hips, and he slid another fraction into her. "You're a little big." "To a woman who's never been tried before, probably." He shifted his weight onto one forearm and gripped her hip with his hand. "Slow down. I don't want to hurt you." She shook her head and tugged his mouth to hers, kissing him, giving back some of the pleasure he'd given her. His fingers tightened on her hip, holding her firmly against the bed as he eased in and out of her, slowly stretching her. The foreignness of his erection inside her faded, along with the slight pain of their coupling, replaced by the electric heat he aroused so easily. Soon he was seated fully within her, and his touch was no longer gentle. It was the raging need of a man lost in the woman he was with. He broke their kiss and thrust into her once, hard. "I'm trying not to hurt you." "You're not." He shuddered and buried his face in her hair, and his breath panted against her, ragged and harsh. His hand skidded down her thigh and curled against it, lifting it, pressing it high against his side, and he began moving, slow and steady, thrusting himself into her. She gave herself over to his touch, to the steady build of passion unleashed. Their flesh met in sharp, even slaps, accompanied by the rain pouring down around their shelter,
and their soft, muted whispers escalated into hoarsely spoken pleas. Alna clutched him to her, poised on the edge of something so wondrous she could scarcely fathom it.
I know,
he said, and pushed himself into her, shoving them both over that cliff into throbbing waves of release. Alna rode the high of their shared pleasure as he pulsed into her, spilling his seed deep within her womb, and he whispered her name into the humid air in a beautifully reverent song. Chapter 9. The rain continued through the night, well into the next morning. Gared woke early and slipped out of bed, leaving Alna alone to rest. They'd pleasured each other twice more after their first coupling, each at her urging. Her hands had wandered over his body with possessive familiarity as she coaxed him into loving her in that proper voice of hers, and he'd given in, as he suspected he always would. He was so close to falling in love with her, it was nearly a done deal. Foolish, foolish heart. He retrieved his tools and a handful of jump chips and settled down on the floor beside the bed. Better to be prepared on the likely chance that Alna changed her mind about returning to Alaria before Raitin's imminent arrival. If worse came to worse, Gared could slip out of the city and hire passage off-world well before Mother Jakuv's wrath rained down upon him. Alna would be fine. He'd see to that before he left. But in spite of what he'd told her, he had no wish to sacrifice his life to Banom's irrational laws. For her, yes, to protect her, to keep her from harm. Of course he'd step in front of her. What kind of man left his heart open to danger? He dropped his head back and stared at the rain dripping through the jungle's canopy onto the biodome. Yup, he was a goner. A delicate hand curled around his nape and the bed shifted against his back. Morning, Alna said. He bent over his work, ignoring the sweetness of her touch. Good morning. You're up early. There's a lot to do before you leave. There's no hurry. She grazed her hand over his hair and down his back, up and down in a slow, steady rhythm. What are you doing? Programming these jump chips to coordinates inside Alaria's shield. Looks complicated. He waggled the tiny screwdriver he held. It takes focus and good eyesight, but it's not hard. I'll take your word for it. She brushed her hand over him a final time, then pressed a soft kiss to the side of his neck. Breakfast soon? I can fix it. She sighed. I thought we settled this yesterday. You don't have to wait on me. He let it go. There was no point in arguing with her. She'd get her way regardless, and he'd end up doing exactly what she wanted him to. Though by vote he'd never let her know he wasn't doing exactly as he wished. If she figured out she could lead him around by the nose, he'd never have a moment's peace. He wasn't that far gone yet, no matter what his traitorous heart said. So he grunted and returned to his work, letting her draw her own conclusions. To his satisfaction, she rolled out of bed with a muttered curse that sounded suspiciously like stubborn Pruxnae. After breakfast, they hiked to the pool through the cool rain and scrubbed each other clean in the sacred waters. Gared was drawn again and again to Ji's serene features, watching over them through her unchanging, immortal facade. Alna threaded her fingers through his and leaned her head on his shoulder. When we get back, I'll pass word to our historians about this place. It'll be nice to know she won't spend the rest of eternity alone. There goes my hiding place. Her hand tightened in his. You're planning on stealing another bride from Zinad? I was kidding. I doubt I'll ever come back. Not ever? He bit back his first thought. If she wanted him, of course he'd come back. But that wouldn't happen, would it? By the time it was safe for him to be on Zinad again, Alna would have contracted with one of Banom's elites. His heart constricted painfully in his chest. That wasn't something he wanted to witness. Probably not. But I thought... Her voice trailed off and her hand slipped out of his. He glanced down.
Her head was bowed. The ends of her long hair dipped into the water, shrouding her face. He tucked a strand behind her ear and studied her profile. The smooth curve of her forehead, the slight tilt to the tip of her nose, the tension firming her mouth. Something was bothering her, though he couldn't for the life of him figure out what. He'd given her what she wanted, assurances of safe passage back to her home, a refuge from the plans he'd formulated the first night they'd met. What more could there be? "What's wrong?" he finally asked. Her gaze lifted slowly to Ji, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with unnamed emotion. "Do you still want me?" "I never stopped." "Because I can give you a daughter," she said in a dull, flat tone. "Because I'm healthy and might be a good breeder." He jerked back, appalled. She wasn't a Crawdon brood mare, to be bought and sold, or discarded when she was no longer useful. "Because you're brave and strong and loyal. Because you'll survive on Abu." Because he'd known the moment he'd seen her that he could love her, and was already more than halfway there. But he wasn't telling her that. Chernon's hammer, she wasn't wiggling all his secrets out of him. Not today. "And yes, because I hope we can have a daughter together, someday when we're ready. Don't you want children?" "I do, yes. A daughter to carry on my work, a son to carry on his father's. More if I'm so blessed." She clapped her hands together and dipped the fingertips 3 times toward Ji. "I want your child." His hand dropped and splashed into the water behind her. "Won't that interfere with your work in the Queen's Guard?" "We have many duties, Guard, including bearing the next generation of guards, if we're so inclined. I still have to serve my time, of course, but it can be delayed until after the birth of my child." She raked her fingers through her hair, impatiently shoving it away from her face. "Mother Jakub encourages us to breed with strong, healthy men. I can't imagine she'd disapprove of you as a father." His breath left him in a rush. "You want to have a child now? I thought you said we hadn't known each other long enough for that." Her eyelids fluttered shut. "You're right. I'm sorry. I thought we could serve both our wishes. Yours for a daughter, mine for something good. It was wrong of me to—" "Stop." He eased her around and cupped her face, tilting it toward his, and kissed her sweet mouth. "I'll do it, if you really want this. All I ask is that I have a place in our child's life." "That goes without saying." He searched her expression for a hint of what she was feeling, for a sliver of truth behind her words. But she'd closed herself off to him, hiding her thoughts. "Can you get pregnant now?" "Possibly." "Are you sure about this, Alna? I don't want you to regret being with me." "I won't. Not in the way you mean." He wanted to press for more, to pry a better explanation out of her, to shout his joy to the heavens and wallow in the relief filling him. She wanted his child, his, not some cockeyed elite with more status and sense. That had to mean something, didn't it? Maybe she was coming to care for him. Maybe he wouldn't have to give her up completely when their time in the ruins came to an end. Maybe he hadn't been so wrong about her after all. He edged closer to her and cradled her against his chest, reveling in her slight weight and the warmth of her skin melding into his, and the Crawdon eternal hope burning steadily in his heart. "Are you sore?" "A little." "We can wait." She shook her head. "Our time is so short, Garrod. Let's not waste what we have left." He kissed her then, tender gratitude for the gift she wanted to give him, for the life she wished to create between them. She returned his caress eagerly, and need blossomed so rapidly its heat overwhelmed him. He made love to her there in the sacred pool amid the crash of water and Ji's eternal gaze, a desperate expression of the desire thrumming through his blood, and of the feelings he didn't dare share with Alna. As passion claimed them in its swift, greedy grasp, he offered a prayer to the goddess sheltering them, for a child to be born of their union, forever a reminder of his brief interlude with the woman he wanted so desperately. Alna reveled in her time with her Pruxnae, in his insistent touch and the soft encouragement he murmured. He never seemed to tire of having her, stirring her passion whenever he arose, holding back only when her energy flagged and sleep dragged her into rest. Though she seldom allowed it, every moment was precious to her, stored carefully in her memory as a talisman against the long, lonely future, a malicious, gaping maw without guard by her side. All her hopes of keeping him in her life were gone, broken by his harshly spoken intent to abandon Zinad, and her with it. How could he do that to her? How could he leave her here as if she meant nothing to him? Why had he captured her if he didn't mean to keep her, to fight for her, to compromise or work out some way of having her outside of Pruxnae tradition? Was she worth so little to him? Her heart trembled on the brink of falling, teetering on the brink between being wholly hers and forever his. And he was leaving. She closed her eyes and rested her head against his chest, panting out soft breaths as her body cooled and her heart settled into a slower rhythm. His raced under the palm she'd tucked between his hand and his sweat-soaked skin. She nipped his shoulder, savoring his salt-tinged masculinity. Another bath soon. This one a quick wash in the steady rain drumming down around them. And maybe after that, a solid meal to fuel the next bout of their lovemaking. He stirred and his soft laugh rumbled beneath her hand. Insatiable. Speak for yourself, Pruxnae. How many times did that make? Not nearly enough. He shifted onto his side and tucked the crown of her head under his chin. Do you want a boy or a girl? Both, she said promptly. Or either, as long as something of him resided within that child. What about you? I'll be happy with whatever blessing Xi bestows upon us. Not your own gods? They've already given me what I wanted, and now Xi will bind me to her. She eased back and met his solemn gaze with her own. What are you saying? What did I tell you that first night? A lot of Pruxnae hokum? She retorted, and he laughed. I said I refused to consider not having you in my life. But you told me you were leaving, Zinad. He snorted. Foolish pride. How long do you think I would have lasted away from you, when I'd already decided you'd be mine? She narrowed her eyes at him. So all that talk about my being safe from you was a lie? Pride, he repeated. Besides, you gave me an out. Did you really expect me not to jump at the chance to have you, in whatever small way, and to share such an important part of myself with you? Tears unexpectedly clogged her throat. She sniffed them back and firmed her heart against the hope rising in it. I was trying to work out a way to keep you. You just never gave me a chance to talk you around to it. I would have listened, eventually. Stubborn Pruxnae, she muttered. Lightning flashed in the night sky, illuminating the jungle's canopy, striking well away from the ruins and their temporary home there. Alma sat up and waited for the inevitable boom of thunder. It pealed in the distance, a quiet mumble interrupting the rain lashing against their shelter. The storm's getting worse, she said. We'll be safe here, as long as the biodome doesn't take a direct hit. She twisted around and stared down at him, at the soft smile he wore and the muted emotion gleaming from his brown-gold eyes. What if the storm gets too close? We can turn off the generator, shut down the energy field. Nothing will bother us in a storm that bad. Another roll of thunder echoed to them, this one much closer, and Alma settled herself in the crook of her lover's arm. Nothing except the storm itself. His fingers skimmed down her shoulder and brushed against the side of her breast. I have an idea. She snickered. I bet you do. Hush, woman. You're in my clutches now, and I'll do with you what I will. He cupped her breast, kneading it gently as his thumb stroked her nipple. I keep waiting for you to tell me you're ready to go back, that you've had enough of me and my manly ways and want to return to your duties with the guard.
That will happen soon enough. And she wasn't willing to risk an early return without assurances that he had a secure way off planet and out of Mother Jakku's retaliatory justice. Tired of me already?
Not even close, beauty.
His hand drifted down, teasing her stomach, and his voice lowered to a rough whisper.
In fact, if you give me another minute, I'll prove it to you again.
Insatiable. His laugh skidded across her sensitive nerves, delighting every single one of them.
You have no idea. How about this time we—
A muted thump shook the earth, halting Guard's words. He rolled off the bed and flicked off their lantern, and the biodome fell into oppressive gloom. Alma scrambled behind him, groping for the gun holstered under the bed on her way onto the floor. We need knives.
They won't do any good against that Crawdon Arigondel.
No, not for it. To cut our way out of the biodome if it fails. A second thud came and a third right behind it, and Alma lowered her voice to a bare whisper. Do you think it remembers where we are?
Let's hope not. Hold on.
He crept away from her, his movements drowned out by the rain and the increasingly loud footsteps of the giant beast headed their way, herded by bright streaks of lightning and continuous booms of thunder. A moment later, Guard pressed clothing and the hilt of a knife into her hand.
Get dressed, he said. We need to be ready to get out of here if that thing breaks through the dome.
She yanked the clothes on, never losing her grip on one weapon or the other. The shirt hung loose on her shoulders, more his size than hers. Hopefully he wasn't trying to fit his bulk into one of her camisoles, though she'd give a quarter's pay to see him try. Did you finish getting the jump chips programmed? His mouth landed on her cheek in a smacking kiss.
You read my mind. Here.
He affixed a chip to the sleeve of her shirt, working around the steadily increasing lightning.
You know what to do?
I know how a jump chip works, Guard.
Testy.
The Arigondel's frantic bleat trumpeted through the night air. So close. Her ears ached in the aftermath. Guard swore under his breath, a colorful mixture of Pruxnae and Bonomian.
I want you to jump now.
She clutched his arm, the closest limb her hand landed on. Forget it. I'm not leaving without you.
I don't want you in harm's way.
I'm not leaving, she gritted out. I care. The Arigondel erupted out of the jungle into the ruined scant clearing and skidded to a halt next to the biodome. Alma's breath froze in her lungs. The thing was huge, far larger than their shelter, and clearly furious. It shook its head from side to side and snorted deep, ragged breaths out of its nose slits, and its clawed feet bumped into the biodome as it skittered and jumped with the storm's irregular howls. Guard eased onto his knees and wrapped his arms around her. He placed his mouth next to her ear and breathed.
I've got you.
The Arigondel reared back onto two legs. Lightning struck a tree at the edge of the ruins. It split and crashed, hitting the Arigondel's bowed spine on its way down. The giant lizard pranced out of the way, screaming its anger into the rain-drenched air. Its front paws lowered right on top of the dome. Guard leapt backward, dragging Alma with him, and the biodome's energy field flickered and snapped under the heavy weight pressing into it. Chapter 10. Guard knotted his hand into a fist around the back of Alma's shirt and pulled her into the kitchen, out of the bedroom. The latter's biodome stuttered and sparked, and failed under the Arigondel's insistent downward thrusts. Its paws crashed into the floor, crushing the bed, and the acrid odor of burnt flesh wafted through the air, overriding the dirt-sweet scent of rain and the sharp bite of ozone. The remaining two biodomes swayed toward the beast, tugged by their bond with the third's neoplastine shell, and Guard cursed under his breath. So much for three being stronger than one. He groped for Alma's hand and yanked her along behind him as he scrambled through the final room and the outside.
Their best bet was to get far enough away from the rampaging monster to jump safely into Ilaria. If all else failed, they could take shelter in G's pool. The trail up to it was too narrow for the Arigondol's barrel-shaped body to navigate, and the hidden recesses of the cavern too deep for the beast's elongated snout to reach. Their bare feet slapped against the dirt-encrusted stone floor, splashing thin rivulets of mud onto their legs. 3 steps outside, and they were drenched from head to toe. Behind them, the Arigondol's trumpeting call rang out, and the biodome's energy field crackled and popped. Guard ensconced Alna behind a tree 30 keg away and studied the nightmare they'd escaped. The Arigondol trampled the biodome, slashing through neoplastine, strewing their belongings across the ruins with every swipe of its clawed paws. The 3rd biodome sparked, and its low light abruptly winked out, and the Arigondol snapped its teeth into the biodome's inner shell, ripping it out of the earth by its roots. Alna tugged at his hand. "Let's go." He nodded and backed away from the tree. At least they'd made it out. The trail wasn't far away, and as long as the Arigondol was occupied destroying their shelter, they'd have a decent chance of making it past any other nasties into G's sanctuary. The Arigondol's head twisted toward them, and Gared's heart sank. "Uh-oh," Alna breathed. He didn't wait to see what the giant lizard would do. In one swift move, he swiveled away from it and launched himself deeper into the ruins, his hand wrapped firmly around Alna's and the knife she held. Her stride matched his as they ducked and wove through the trees and light undergrowth that had managed to take root among the stone tiles. The Arigondol's heavy paws slammed into the ground behind them, shaking everything for half a click around them. A tree splintered and crashed onto the stone floor beside them, blocking the foot of the path leading to the pool. Guard pivoted away from it, taking Alna with him, and ducked behind a wide tree. Lightning slashed through the night at the edge of the ruins, and the hairs on Gared's arms stood on end. Thunder boomed on its heels, deafening him, and the Arigondol's tail whipped out, too swiftly for Gard to track it in the mottled collage of light and dark. It sliced into the tree they were hiding behind, ripped it clean in 2, and thunked into Gard's torso with a sickening crunch. He soared through the air, screaming Alna's name, and slammed into the side of the cliff housing G's pool. His head snapped back into the rock, and he tumbled headlong into the tempest-drenched jungle. Alna landed on her side against the stone floor. Air squeezed out of her lungs, and she gasped for breath, struggling against the pain dimming her vision to brilliant pinpricks against her closed eyelids. The Arigondol's tail swept around in a wide arc, felling every tree in its path. She curled into a ball, hands over her head, and waited it out behind the relative safety of the splintered trunk she and Gared had hidden behind. Her vision gradually cleared, and she heaved in a welcome breath. Blessed G, that had been close. Thankfully, the Arigondol had been far enough away that only the end of its long tail had hit the tree. Otherwise, it would have swept her and Gared both into the surrounding landscape. She eased upright and peered over the ruined trunk. The Arigondol was hunkered down near the bottom of the pool's trail, its blunt nose sniffing a downed tree. Lightning zigzagged across the sky, slapping through the jungle, and in its flash, a horrifying sight appeared. Gard was sprawled in an unmoving heap at the base of the trail, right under the Arigondol's questing nose. Its tongue flicked out, raking over him, and Alna burst into action. She fumbled blindly for the gun that had slipped out of her hand on her trip into the earth and landed on her knife instead. It was too small, not even long enough to dig through the lizard's skin into its tender flesh, but it was better than nothing. She gripped it in her left hand and resumed her search for the gun, glancing between the ground and the Arigondol as lightning blazed and shimmered around her. The Arigondol butted its nose into Gared's waist, and Alna stifled a frustrated scream. What could she do? What could she use? Her gaze landed on a sliver of wood as long as her arm. She limped toward it and hefted it, judging its breadth and sharpened point against the Arigondol's thick hide. Not great, but not the worst thing ever. The lizard reared back, preparing to strike, and Alna screamed, "Over here, you rot-infested mealy worm!" It swiveled toward her, away from Gared's helpless form,
"That's right," she said. "There's a nice juicy human right here. Much better than that nasty old Pruxnae."
The Arigondel sniffed, and if she didn't know better, she could have sworn the blasted thing was laughing at her. She stamped her feet and screamed again, and finally the dim-witted monster padded toward her, away from the tempting meal Gared presented. Alna slid her bare feet through gelatinous mud one backward step at a time, drawing the beast away from her lover. Pain throbbed through her side, and her healing palms protested her tight grips around the knife and the stick. Too bad. They were her only weapons against the Arigondel, her only hope of possibly wounding it. Killing it was out. The twice-cursed thing was too big, too resilient, and far too tough. If she could just find her gun. The Arigondel crouched, then sprang toward her. Alna leapt to the side, barely clearing its landing, and rolled into the trunk of a fallen tree. Something hard dug into her back. She squirmed around, both eyes on the Arigondel as it crept around and repositioned itself, and her arm whacked into the butt of her gun. She dropped her knife, wrapped her hand around the gun's grip, and tugged. It didn't budge. A massive paw landed on the ground next to her leg, clicking barbed claws into hexagonal stone tiles, and she jumped. The Arigondel snuffled and eyed her, tilting its head from side to side, and her heart galloped into an unsteady run. This was it. It was going to kill her and Gared both, and the happiness they'd found would end here in the forgotten ruins, forever lost. The child they'd both wanted would never be born. Their families would never know what had happened to them. Alna breathed out a sorrowful laugh. Mother Jakuv would be furious that one of her candidates had slipped away without a trace, unreachable in death as Alna had never been in life. Her family would mourn. Alna's grip slipped on the wooden stake and it jangled onto the stone. They'd sacrificed so much for her, scraped and saved and done without, all to vault their eldest daughter into the upper echelons of Banamian society. She was supposed to have served out her term among the Queen's Guard and used her position to better theirs. She was supposed to have repaid their sacrifice with her own, to marry well and bear children, to secure a comfortable life for her parents in their elder years, and good positions among the elite for her siblings as they embarked on the journey destiny intended for them. Alna's search for Gared's limp body among the Arigondel's mess. All her life, she'd believed duty to family, to Mother Jakuv and her fellow sisters, and to the Queen, was her destiny. She'd worked and scrimped and studied, often long after the other candidates had given up. She'd pushed herself beyond her limits time and again, believing unfailingly that Zinod was where she belonged, that her rightful place was here among the jungle she both loved and despised. But a guard's duty took many forms, and her heart was one of them. Gared had claimed her love the night he'd whisked her beyond Mother Jakuv's reach, and in embracing destiny, had irrevocably bound his to hers. He believed in her, in them, and had been willing to do whatever it took to stay with her, even if the only way he could have her was to share a child with her. He'd made all the sacrifices, risking his life and his heart, and she had clung to duty, using it as a shield against the future he offered her. In that moment, everything Alna believed tilted and whirled, and resettled into something horrifyingly new. She had been so wrong about him, so incredibly wrong about herself. Duty had never been her fate, not the way she'd interpreted it, as the rigid rigors of candidate, guard, and finally wife to a cold-hearted elite. Her destiny had always been Gared and the love he'd given so freely. And now, her duty to him overrode any duty she had to self. Alna grasped the stick and pushed herself to her feet, facing the Arigondel as a proud warrior of the House of Jakuv. If it was her destiny to die protecting her beloved Pruxnae, then so be it. There were worse ways to leave this life, and far worse ways to live it. The Arigondel lowered its head and batted a paw toward her. Alna dropped flat onto the stone floor, rolled onto her back through muddy puddles, and stabbed the stick point first into the thick-soled pad of its foot. It screamed a harsh trumpet and wagged its elongated head back and forth, slinging water into the rain pounding down around them. Its paw slapped into the ground and wobbled onto its side, into the fallen tree. The trunk skidded under the force of the hit, sliding away from Alna, and the gun rebounded away from it in quick, flat circles across the stone. Alna grabbed for it as it skated past her, and snagged the barrel. The Arigondel thunked its nose painfully hard into her back, and her breath wheezed out. Blessed she, the thing was brutally strong. She maneuvered herself around, ignoring the twinges of a broken rib and the ache of bruised muscles, and fumbled with the gun's rain-slicked metal and plastine construction. Lightning struck nearby, startling the Arigondel into a skittering prance across the ruins, and Alna's sore palm finally settled around the gun's grip. She aimed and fired. Nothing happened. Her heart shriveled and dropped like a stone into her gut. Garrett's blasted lock. He'd forgotten to thumb it off. She explored the side with shaky hands, clicked the safety into another position, just in case, and tried again. This time, a red energy pulse burst out of the barrel into the night, and the Arigondel swung toward her. She fired deliberately timed shots into its scaled hide as she eased onto her feet and backed carefully toward Garrett. The hits barely phased the Arigondel. It shook each one off, quickly at first, gradually with more effort. At last, Alna reached Garrett and crouched beside him, searching for any hint that he was still among the living. Her fingers landed on a sluggish pulse, and she slumped under a wave of relief. He was alive, probably badly injured. It was up to her to save him, to save them both. She fired a rapid burst of shots at the Arigondel, depleting the gun's battery. As soon as the last shot sputtered out, she tossed the gun aside. Without another battery, it was useless, and the Arigondel was simply too close for anything else. Alna hauled Garrett upright and straddled his lap, holding him tightly against her chest, and groped over her shirt for the jump chip. The Arigondel's breath whooshed out, hitting her full force in the back, and she prayed to Ji and her pantheon, to Garrett's gods, to anyone listening. Let them be safe. Let them make it to Ilaria. The Arigondel's jaws snapped shut in the air above her. Alna's palm slammed into the jump chip. The world around her spun in a dizzying circle of light, and winked out as the giant beast moved in for the kill. Chapter 11. The world slowly righted itself and coalesced into a dimly lit street. Alna turned her head away from Garrett and retched, half afraid the queasiness lingering in the post-jump stillness would shove itself up her throat and onto the flat-topped cobblestones. The retch morphed into a rattling cough, and she spat bloodied phlegm out of her mouth. Great, no telling what damage the cursed beast had done to her. Garrett moaned, and she turned back to him. His rugged features were battered and bruised under a slimy layer of mud. Blood trickled from one corner of his mouth, and one arm hung at an odd angle away from his torso. She couldn't look at the rest of him, couldn't bear to see how badly he'd been hurt. They were safe now. Even the Queen couldn't refuse an injured man treatment, no matter what his crimes. Alna summoned what breath she could and said, "To me, my sisters!" The hoarse cry petered out, too weak to be heard above the distant roll of thunder. She sucked in a short breath, winced against the band of pain wrapped around her chest. "Sisters!" A booted heel scraped against the street. "Who's there?" "Alna Lomig," she said, knowing exactly what reaction her name would bring. "Traitor," a voice hissed. "Take her," another said. Alna held up an unsteady hand. "I go willingly, but please, I have an injured man here. He needs aid." Rough hands jerked Alna upright, away from Garrett, and a familiar face appeared in front of her. Kraty's ebony features were impassive, her voice flat. "Alna Lomig, you are under arrest on the charges of high treason, dereliction of duty, and conspiring with a known thief for ill-gotten gain." All of that was true, wasn't it? Alna had turned her back on duty when she'd accepted Garrett into her life.
abandoned it for a few stolen days with him in the sacred ruins he'd shared with her. And he was a thief, the benefactor of his people's long tradition of wooing their brides away from home and hearth. None of it could be denied. And so she didn't bother, giving voice instead to the single hope residing within her. She lifted her gaze to Crates and silently begged for her friend's understanding, and for her help. "Save him," she whispered. Something terribly close to pity flickered across the other woman's expression, gone in a heartbeat. She stepped back and nodded to the women holding Alna. The butt of a sword cracked into the side of Alna's head, and she passed out, a dead weight in the unforgiving grips of the sisters who'd once been her friends. She floated into consciousness, accompanied by hushed whispers and furtive footsteps. Her ribs ached. Her body was a throbbing bruise from head to toe. She tried to touch the agony in her head and came up short, stopped by the metal cuffs pinning her to the smooth floor in what appeared to be a receiving room in the Queen's palace. Well, wasn't this a familiar scenario? Garid groaned from somewhere nearby, and Alna forced herself to move against the dizziness whirling through her. His shirt was gone, replaced by clean white bandages layered across his chest and along one arm. He was chained to the floor within arm's reach. She crawled to him and checked his pulse. It beat hard and firm under her fingertips. "See how she protects the Pruxnae," a frigid voice said, and Alna's eyelids slid shut. The Queen. There would be no mercy for her now. Mother Jakuv grunted. "Misplaced loyalty." "A good swive will do that to a woman." Someone tittered, earning a hard stare from Mother Jakuv. "Alna Lomig," she said in the frighteningly round tones of a blooded aristocrat. "The Pruxnae is charged with kidnapping a guard from her duty. The Queen has demanded his head as penance." Alna slowly lifted her gaze and met Mother Jakuv's head on. "I was with him willingly, knowing what he was." Mother Jakuv arched a single black eyebrow. "You confess to forsaking your duties in favor of a man?" "I do." "Strange. Our security drones have a crystal-clear vid of him carrying you out of your quarters." Mother Jakuv swept one beringed hand toward a wide wall where a series of images flickered to life. Alna's door opening, Garid walking out with her in a limp heap over his shoulders, her arms flopping against his broad back. "What say you, Sister Lomig?" "The drone must be mistaken. He asked me to go with him. I was willing." The Queen tapped her fingers over a patently fake yawn. "These things always go in cycles, don't they? First the confession, then the tearful pleas for his life. Truly, Mother Jakuv, I grow weary of such tedious proceedings." Mother Jakuv's thin mouth twitched. "And I grow weary of bringing them before you." "Lies," the Queen said, her young voice bland. "I've never met a woman more enamored of pestering me with trifling matters of the heart." "These are matters of the state, my Queen." "It's all the same to me." At Mother Jakuv's continued stare, the Queen huffed out a short breath. "Oh, very well. Let's get on with it then." "You are ever gracious, my Queen." Mother Jakuv flicked her long snow-white robes into straight lines, then tucked her hands behind her back. "As I cannot believe a sister under my care would neglect her duty, I call forth the Pruxnae, Garid ab Einif, as witness to this matter." Alna gasped. "Garid testify?" No, he was too weak, and he might tell the unvarnished truth. "Mother Jakuv!" Mother Jakuv silenced Alna with a single glance of her icy blue eyes. "What say you, Pruxnae?" Garid moaned, drawing Alna's glance. His skin was pasty pale, his beautiful eyes unfocused. He rolled onto his side and carefully maneuvered himself onto his knees. Alna knelt behind him, one hand on his shoulder. "Garid, don't. You'll hurt yourself." "She needs an answer, Beauty." He pushed himself upright, staggered once, then planted his bare feet firmly against the cold floor. "Alna Lomig has clung to her duty since our first meeting.
Garid! Alna hissed. Mother Jakuv's thin hand flashed out, arcing across her slender body. Silence, sister! She has. Garid's breath shuddered out, and he swallowed once. She nearly escaped once. Would have if she hadn't run into a colony of kikis. Mother Jakuv snorted. Poetic justice, considering. She would have tried again if I hadn't promised to escort her to Ilaria as soon as I secured passage off-planet. In exchange for the delay, she asked me to father her first child. It was understood that we'd part company as soon as she returned to her duties here. Alna scowled at him. Is that what he really thought? Or was he bending the truth to suit his own purposes? Kraden Pruxnae. Why couldn't he just go along with her story and let her save him, the way she was supposed to? A canny negotiator. Mother Jakuv's thin lips twitched into a pleased smile. Captured by a Pruxnae, and she still finds a way to fulfill her duty. I wanted to be with him, Alna insisted. Do you still? Mother Jakuv's voice rang through the room, bouncing into every corner. Garid stiffened. His hands curled into shaky fists at his sides, and Alna could stand no more. She stood and came even with him, and wrapped her hand around his waist, steadying him. I do, she said softly. And so you choose him over the life of service duty demands? I choose both. Alna raised her chin and gazed around the room, at the Queen and Mother Jakuv, at the guards assembled in a loose semicircle around them, at Krati, her friend and companion these many years, and finally at Garid, the man she hoped to love. The first lesson a sister learns in the house of Jakuv is duty, but duty has many forms. We have a duty to family, a duty to our sisters and the mother guiding us. We have a duty to Queen and the many citizens depending on us to provide safe shelter from nature's fury. We also have a duty to self, to the path fate has decreed, regardless of what that path is. I fulfill my duty in many ways, Mother Jakuv. I will gladly serve the mandatory tour as a guard wherever the Queen would have me. Even now I may carry Garid's child, thus filling the ranks of the next generation of guards. Alna inhaled a deep breath, let it out slowly, and tugged the jump chip off her ragged sleeve. And I offer the coordinates of a lost temple of Ji as further evidence of my commitment to the duty you have taught me. Garid tilted his head toward her and muttered, What are you doing? Buying your safety. She held the chip out in the flat of her palm. In exchange for this knowledge, Mother Jakuv, I ask only that the Pruxnae be allowed to go free. The Queen shifted in her chair. She asks much, particularly for a woman who confessed to willfully shirking her duty. You would punish her? Mother Jakuv asked. I certainly can't have her among my guards. Think of the disruption it would cause if every sister fled her post simply to have a man between her thighs. What do you suggest? The Queen smiled, cold and calculating. Why, Mother Jakuv, you know very well what I have in mind. Mother Jakuv nodded. Alna Lomig, you are stripped of your position in the Queen's Guard and hereby banished. The blood drained from Alna's head, and her hand dropped to her side. Banished? After exhibiting her duty so clearly? Where would she go? Her parents were here in Banam. Her friends and her life? With that kind of smudge hanging over her head, she couldn't seek refuge with them and wouldn't be able to find work. Not on any planet that had treaties with her native land. She'd never be able to pay the fines imposed along with her punishment, and her family would once again suffer on her behalf. Garid cupped her shoulder and cradled her close. She's the innocent here. Why are you punishing her? She was willing, the Queen said, her tone mocking. What happens to a woman who willingly gives herself to a Pruxnae, Mother Jakuv? She loses her heart. Mother Jakuv waved 2 guards forward. The 2 of you will be escorted to a medical facility, where you will remain until I pass final judgment on the terms of Sister Lomig's banishment. Sister Flenig, retrieve the chip. Alna clutched it close to her chest. I won't turn this over unless Gard can go free. The queen's hand slapped onto her breeches-clad thighs. Blessed G! Hand over the chip, Sister Lomig, and I will personally escort him unharmed to the nearest port. Alna nodded and passed the chip to Krati. Krati's hand clasped over Alna's, a fleeting reminder of their friendship. She stepped away and was gone, and Alna allowed herself to be separated from Gard and led out of the queen's presence to await the details of her punishment. The walk between the judgment room and the infirmary was long and difficult. Gard wavered between lucidity and a draining fatigue that sent him staggering down the long, wide corridors. Gentle, calloused hands righted him, aiding his faltering steps. He shrugged them off. They reminded him too much of the way Alna had helped him during that farce of a meeting. By Fru, what justice was there in this place? Wasn't it obvious that he'd taken her against her will? What more did the cold-hearted mother need besides his confession and the drone's vids? And still they'd banished his beauty for something she'd had no hand in. A firm grip clasped his elbow and led him into a stark room smelling vaguely of astringent disinfectant. Gard shivered in the sudden chill and, when told to, dropped into an armless chair in the room's center. He eyed the metal instruments laid out on a tray set on a gleaming white counter along one side of the room. So that was the way of it. Bandage him, take down his confession, then torture him for daring to love one of Banam's precious queen's guards. He snorted and slumped in the chair. And these Kraden Banamians thought the Pruxnae were uncivilized. What kind of nation punished an innocent? What kind of woman confessed to sins that weren't her own? Black spots dotted the insides of his eyelids. Gard shook himself back to full consciousness and focused on Alna. Sweet Alna. Where was she? What were these cursed people doing to her? Were they even now torturing her? Or had Mother Jakuv imposed her sentence and escorted Alna to the nearest port? No matter. As soon as his head cleared, he'd escape his jailers and find her. The details on how he'd do that were hazy. Everything was a little too hazy, as a matter of fact. From how he'd gotten back to Ilaria, to whose soft breaths were disrupting the stillness. But he'd do it. Hadn't he sworn he'd never be able to live without her, now that he'd found her? A Pruxnae always gets his woman, and she was his now. Forever. With that in mind, he braced himself and stood. Darkness crowded the edges of his mind, threatening to tow him under. He doubled over and breathed deeply, waiting out the urge to succumb to it and fall straight onto the blindingly white tile floor, ignoring the throbbing pain in his torso and thighs. Kraden Arigondel. He frowned and prodded his muddied memory. At least, he thought there'd been an Arigondel. Sometime. A different hand snagged his elbow, this one broad and long-fingered, and a low masculine voice said, "The Pruxnae are too stubborn for their own good." Gard grunted. "Got things to do. If those things involve a certain queen's guard, relax. She's in the next room over getting her wounds tended." The hand tugged gently. "This will be a lot easier if you sit back down." "So you can torture me? So I can heal you?" A hint of humor underscored the man's words. He released Gard's arm. Metal scraped against cloth, rustling it, and something cold pressed against the inside of Gard's elbow. "An antibiotic. Didn't have time before the hearing to administer this. It might sting a little." A needle pricked Gard's skin. The area around it tingled and burned, and he swayed on his feet. "Sit down," the man said. "If you pass out, I'll have to call Sister Flenig back in here, and I'm fairly certain she won't be gentle getting you upright again." Gard plopped into the chair and risked opening one eyelid. The man sitting beside him was tall and well-built, and too athletic under his plain white tunic to be a healer. His piercing black eyes were set into a lean, tanned face, and seemed strangely familiar. Guard prodded his memory, searching for a match, and gave up when all that came to mind was a blurry vision of Mother Jakuv's stern countenance. "Who's Sister Flenig?" he asked. "The guard that brought you here, a good friend of Sister Lomig's, if rumor holds true, and none too happy with you for kidnapping her." The man sorted through his instruments, selected a pre-filled syringe, and pressed it against Guard's throat. "The House of Jakuv has been in hysterics over the past few days, in spite of Mother's insistence that all was well. Since the two of you are back now, safe from your adventures, maybe everyone will calm down." She was safe. Or safe enough, except for the Kikis, and the Krod and Arigandel. The man jabbed another syringe against the inside of Guard's good elbow, and Guard winced. "How many more of those are you going to stick me with?" "That was the last one. A liquid multivitamin to help speed things along." The man cupped Guard's jaws between his hands and tilted his head toward the room's overhead light. Your pupils are dilated. Do you recognize me?" "You're the man trying to torture me to death with needles. Pretty sure I'll never forget you." The man's black eyebrows snapped down over his dark eyes. "By Vode. After all the time we spent running around Munad province together? Amazing." "You're Pruxnae?" Guard asked slowly. "Half or all, depending on the way you look at it." "Once a Pruxnae. Always a Pruxnae." The man snorted out a laugh. "I haven't heard that in years. When we left Abu, Mama forbade me from even speaking Pruxnae. It hurt too much to hear Papa in my voice, I think." "Papa," Guard murmured. Memory intruded, of a slender boy, his shaggy black hair a halo around his thin face, and three voices raised in laughter. Guard, his brother Rightim, and the young man they'd thought lost along with his mother. "Ledig ab Tabri. We'd about given up hope of ever finding you and your mother again." "You wouldn't have, if you hadn't picked a sister of the House of Jakuv to kidnap." "Who could resist such a beauty?" Ledig grinned. "I've often asked myself the same thing. Mother only selects the finest to become a Jakuv." "Mother as in?" Ledig shook his head and a small furrow appeared between the thick slash of his eyebrows. "Mama died not long after we arrived here. Heartache. She never really got over Papa's death." Guard leaned forward and dropped an unsteady hand on Ledig's shoulder. "I'm sorry to hear that. She was a good woman." "She was." Ledig set the spent needle on the tray and pushed it away. "She loved you and Rightim, almost as much as she loved me. Leaving Abu was as hard on her as anything else." "Then why did she do it? She could have stayed and made a place for herself there." "And be forced into another marriage when the traditional mourning period was over?" Ledig shook his head. "She loved my father too much. Another man would never do for her. She told me as much not long after we left, when I was pining for the cool, clear streams of Abu. Blessed Ji, I miss swimming there." The door whooshed open behind Ledig, and Mother Jakuv entered. She stared down her regal nose at Guard as the door shut behind her, and he stared right back. By Vode, he wasn't going to be intimidated by a Banamian bureaucrat eager to throw her weight around. He got enough of that back home watching his father wade through Munad province's business during his duties as its Kof. "Have you finished catching up yet, Ledig?" she asked. Ledig flashed an easy smile at her. "We haven't seen each other in years, and you expect us to catch up in a handful of ticks?" "It's been a good deal longer than a handful." She twitched her robe into place and arched a single black eyebrow. "Nephew?" The gumption drained right out of Guard's spine. He slumped against the frigid metal back of his chair. "Nephew?" "Guard, meet my aunt Dicha, the current head of the House of Jakuv." Ledig slumped into his own chair, and his smile stretched into a grin. Mama's eldest sister. Gared bit back a groan. Great. Of all the women to head Banam's most prestigious house, it had to be one who'd lost a sister to the Pruxnae. Talk about a deep-seated grudge. He managed to keep his expression neutral and gritted out a polite, "A pleasure, Mother Jakuv." Her thin lips lifted into a cold smile. "Is it manners that accompany your greeting, or the desire to curry favor with the one in charge of your beloved's fate?" He dropped all pretense of politeness and glared at her. "Alna's fate is her own." "No one has control over her fate, as my sister learned the day she was kidnapped by one of your vermin-ridden men." She hissed in a sharp breath and let it out slowly. "Tabri was meant for other things, better things." "Better than finding love and a family." Gared crossed his arms over his chest. Two could play at this game, and he was well versed in defending the Pruxnae customs. She could have stayed here and become a bitter, sterile old woman, too focused on garnering power to do anything with her life. Ledig winced, but Mother Jakuv merely blinked. "A bitter, sterile old woman, am I? I'll have to remember that the next time the Queen chastises me for allowing yet another Pruxnae into the house of Jakuv." Gared's anger drained away in a rush. "Eh?" "Tabri bade me promise 2 things with her dying breaths: that I would care for her only child." Mother Jakuv rested a hand on Ledig's shoulders, and something akin to fondness softened her stern features. "And that I would, from time to time, allow a Pruxnae to persuade one of my candidates to his side. She grew too fond of her adoptive world and too concerned over Abu's dwindling population." Ledig covered her hand with one of his and squeezed. "Strong neighbors make good allies, Dicha." "So Tabri always swore, and now I must carry the burden of feeding off my best candidates as broodmares in the hopes of bolstering a fading culture." Mother Jakuv turned impassive, icy eyes on Gared. "Alna Lomig could have had a bright future here." "She still could if your laws weren't so draconian," Gared retorted. "When did it become Banam's practice to punish a woman for crimes she never committed?" "Ah, that was just an excuse. The Queen well knows my position on alliances between my house and the Pruxnae." "You banished her." Mother Jakuv clucked her tongue. "I should never have expected patience from a man who thinks nothing of stealing his woman before she's ready to love him. Guard!" The door swooshed open and Sister Flenig popped her head inside. "Yes, Mother Jakuv?" "Bring Sister Lomig in." The guard's dark eyes drifted to Gared. Then she nodded sharply and left. A moment later, the door opened again and Alna stepped inside the white-drenched room. Her skin was paper-thin and far too pale, but her eyes were bright and her chin was jutted out at a challenging angle. "Mother Jakuv," she said. "Sister Lomig, tend to your Pruxnae. He's positively pining for you." Alna nodded as she skirted the other woman and stopped at Gared's side. In a low voice she said, "Are they treating you well?" Gared waggled his thumb at Ledig. "That one's determined to prick me to death with his needles." Ledig laughed. "Like you haven't done worse to me. Do you remember the time—" "Boys, reminisce later," Mother Jakuv said mildly. "Sister Lomig, are you ready for your sentence?" "She doesn't deserve—" Gared began. Alna dropped her hand onto his shoulder, interrupting the start of the tirade he'd planned to batter the House of Jakuv's leader with. She threw her shoulders back and met Mother Jakuv's gaze head-on. "I'm ready." "Good. At least someone here has some sense." Mother Jakuv flicked her robes again, then clasped her narrow hands together behind her back. "Sister Alna Lomig, for the crime of allowing a cursed Pruxnae to kidnap you, you are hereby banished from Alaria's only spaceland port." Alna's fingernails dug into Gared's bare skin. "And
Isn't that enough, child? Do you want to lose the ability to see your family and friends forever? Simply because you had the misfortune to catch the eye of a—
Dicha, Ledig warned. He's like a brother to me. Mother Jakuv's mouth snapped shut.
I have regretted making that deathbed promise from the moment the words left my lips.
Tough, Gared said. It's done now.
And you intend to hold me to it?
To the very letter, if he had to. Alna's name will be cleared.
It would never have been besmirched if some of the sisters' speculations hadn't run rampant. In spite of what you might think, Pruxnae, we treat our citizens well. Sister Lomig would have received a full and fair trial upon her return to us, if circumstances hadn't dictated otherwise.
So her name will be cleared.
I'll see to it personally. After all, her daughter will fill her place in due time, and she'll need a spotless reputation to be eligible for the position.
Gared sucked in a protesting breath, but Alna beat him to a reply. She nodded once and, bizarrely, her hand relaxed on his shoulder.
Of course, Mother Jakuv. I'll see to her training during the earliest years, until her acceptance into your secondary program. See that you do. And now, other matters require my attention. Good day to you all. Sister Lomig? Yes, Mother Jakuv. Good fortunes to you. And to you, Mother.
Mother Jakuv nodded sharply and marched out in a swirl of white robes. Ledig turned a satisfied smile on Gared. You always were able to wiggle out of trouble. Slippery as a greased kiki is this one, Sister Lomig. You'll have your hands full keeping him in line. Alna's hand slid off Gared's shoulder.
Undoubtedly. Is there somewhere we can go? A place we can eat and rest?
Your quarters here are still yours, Ledig said gently. Do you need help getting there?
No, we'll be fine.
Ledig ended up helping Gared upright after all. His Kroden legs were too wobbly to hold all his weight, probably thanks to those multivitamins Ledig had jacked into his system. Gared slung an arm around his old friend's shoulders. Alna braced up his other side, careful of his bandaged arm. Between the two, they carefully maneuvered Gared out the healing room's doors into the wide corridor while he did his best not to pass out or dwell too hard on the day's revelations. In the days after their escape from the Arigandel, Alna tended Gared in her old room in the house of Jakuv in between fielding visits from her friends and calls from her family. That her banishment extended to a single port on the edges of the prime city still amazed her. It could have been worse. So much worse that she'd sat in the healer's rooms after the hearing with tears in her eyes, struggling to figure out how to say goodbye to her family before she was kicked off Zinad. That hadn't been necessary. By Ji's grace and with the goodwill of the queen. Alna pressed the backs of her fingers to Gared's forehead and bit back her relief. His skin was cool to the touch and dry. In spite of the house doctor's treatment, he'd succumbed to a fever the night of the hearing and had drifted in and out of consciousness for the past 3 days. His wounds hadn't gotten infected, a small mercy that, after the damage the Arigandel had done. Broken ribs, a concussion, contusions from head to toe, and a sprained elbow. It was a wonder he'd survived. When she'd told Ledig that, he'd grinned and said, "The Pruxnae are too stubborn to die before they've claimed their brides." And that had cut her questions off in a hurry. Gared had had few lucid moments over the past few days, none long enough for them to discuss what had happened at any length. He'd asked her once if she'd heard from Ryton, and she answered honestly. His brother hadn't been heard from, and Krati had someone watching the port for his arrival. That had been a surprise in and of itself. Krati had been waiting for them that day, outside the room where Ledig had tended Gared. She'd escorted them to Alna's room. In a hushed aside, she'd explained everything that had happened during Alna's absence. The search for her when she didn't show up at guard duty, the rush by some sisters to proclaim Alna's alliance with a Pruxnae in a misguided attempt to wiggle their way into Mother Jakuv's good graces.
"Didn't work," Krati had whispered. "I told her myself you'd never abandon your duty for a man, that you'd never looked twice at one before you met the Pruxnae. Do you know what she said? That a Pruxnae's charms were more potent than duty. What do you make of that?"
Alna hadn't known what to think of Mother's pronouncement. Silence had seemed the best defense anyway, and Krati hadn't seemed to mind. She chattered on and on about house gossip, who had contracted with what elite, which sisters were on the outs with Mother, how many new candidates there were, as if Alna cared about such matters. She did, in a way. The house of Jakuv had sheltered her for too long for her not to care. But her most pressing duty at the moment had very little to do with the life she'd no longer be living. Alna resettled herself on a cushion beside her bed, where Garid slept peacefully. Her future was a void she had no idea how to fill. It had been settled for so long from the time of her arrival in Mother's care, truth be told, that this new blankness unsettled her. What would she do, now that her duties with the Queen's Guard had been terminated? A faint knock hit the door, then Krati stuck her head inside.
"Is he awake?"
Alna shook her head and waved her friend inside. Garid panicked every time another sister was in the room, Krati included. The first time he'd fumbled for a gun and muttered something about saving Alna from her crowded draconian homeworld. The second time he'd attempted a fevered punch at another sister. After that, Alna had been very careful to shoo her numerous visitors away as soon as he stirred from his healing slumber. Krati flopped quietly onto the floor next to Alna.
"Any change?"
"The fever's gone. Another day or so and he'll be stable enough for us to leave."
"Don't say that, Alna. I'm not ready for you to go."
And Alna wasn't quite ready to leave yet. But she had to do something with her life, didn't she? Staying on in the house of Jakuv was out. Even if she hadn't lost her position as a Queen's Guard, she would have left soon to seek out her own accommodations anyway. And she had to find a way to support her family, who'd been counting on the additional credits Alna would earn as a guard. It would be hard to secure a good job here in Banam, where gossip had surely already circulated, whether Mother Jakuv wanted it to or not. No, it was better to leave soon and hope for the best in one of the surrounding systems. Maybe even on Abu, though she wasn't staking her hopes there. Garid had been subjected to a lot of trouble on her account. Maybe he wouldn't want to go through any more. An odd pressure squeezed the breath out of her lungs. Better not to think about that. It really was. Krati dropped her voice to a low whisper.
"He'll let you visit, won't he?"
"Since when did a man keep a sister from doing anything?"
"You know what I mean. I can't come to Abu. You know that."
True enough. The first tour was brutal on a sister in many ways, chief among them being the requirement to stay planetside. No sister with any sense would willingly plop herself down among a bunch of women-stealing men. The thought tickled her funny bone, and Alna snickered.
"I should set you up with his brother." "Right him? No, he's not for me. Besides, he'll have his kidnapped bride charmed into compliance by the time he gets back here."
"Then another," Alna insisted, suddenly desperate for a friendly face among Garid's people, if he claimed her.
"Let's see how you like it first."
Krati threaded her arm through Alna's and snuggled against her.
"So, there's this delicious rumor going around that Pruxnae men are built where it really counts, and Rightim refused to confirm it, that naughty boy."
They settled in for a nice long chat, held in murmurs low enough not to disturb Garid's sleep. Krati left near sunset with a grimace and a muttered reference to that night's duties.
"Reclaiming that site your man found? Thanks much."
After she left, Alna arranged for meals to be brought to her room. While she waited for their arrival, she sorted her clothing, a task she'd picked up and dropped several times over the past few days. What would she need in her new life? Lightweight clothing, winter gear, or a bit of everything? She still hadn't decided where she was going to go, and she wasn't quite able to bring herself to think too hard on the possibility of building a life with Garid. A soft cough interrupted the negative spiral of her thoughts. She whirled toward the bed. Gared was partially turned toward her. His gaze was fixed on her, and a slight frown marred his expression. She gently tucked the tunic she held back into its proper place, then dropped onto the cushion beside the bed. "Hey," she said. His eyelids slid shut and he swallowed hard. "How long have I been out?" "Days. You were running a fever and—" She slid her hand into his, unable to resist touching him. "How do you feel?" "Like a herd of Winyu stampeded across my ribs." "Close enough. Do you need anything? Can I get you some water?" "Just you, beauty." "I'm here. There's food coming and—" "No," he said firmly. "Up here with me. I need to know you're really safe." "Gared, your ribs." "I don't care. Call me stupid if you want. Just get up here with me." "Typical Pruxnae," she muttered sourly, but up she went, right into his arms. She curled up against him, careful not to put any weight on him, and tucked her head under his chin. "There's still no sign of your brother." "He'll be here soon. If not, we'll hitch a ride to Abu on a passenger ship." "We?" "I'm not leaving you here," he said in a rough growl. "Crawdon Bonamians. I don't care if you're only banished from one port. It's downright shameful the way the Queen treated you, and Mother Jakuv wasn't much better." "You still want me?" His arms tightened around her and he shook her slightly. "Of course I do. You're to be my wife and the mother of my children. I thought we'd already worked this out." "But at the hearing, you said—" "What I had to protect you. None of this was your fault." "I chose to stay with you." "Only until we could get you safely back to Ilaria." "No, Gared, listen." She struggled out of his embrace and braced herself above him. "If I really wanted to leave, I could have at any time. I stayed because I wanted to be with you." His eyes flew open and he met her gaze, his searching hers carefully. "What are you saying?" "That I care about you. Is that so hard to believe?" He was silent for a long time, so long she was ready to nudge a response out of him. At last he said, "Only care?" No, she wanted to shout, "I love you," but the words stayed in her mouth, chained there by her own fear. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth, beauty. Only that." He grazed a single fingertip along her cheek and down her throat, and his eyelids fluttered shut. "What if I told you I love you? That I couldn't let you go even if I wanted to?" "So soon?" "How long does it take to fall in love? A few days, a year, a lifetime?" He rolled his shoulders and his hand fell away from her. "Claiming you wasn't an impulse. It was a calculated risk, one I was willing to take in exchange for a future with a woman like you." "A breeder?" "Are we back to that again?" "It's the truth." "It's part of the truth, Alna, a part you deliberately overplay. Is it so hard to believe that I love you? All of you? Not just your womb?" She firmed her lips against a smile and the growing thrill of knowing he loved her. "Where's your charm now, Pruxnae?" "That Crawdon Arigondel stomped it out of me. Don't make me beg." "Why would you?" "To hear you say it, just once. To know you'll come with me, willingly this time. That you'll fight for my heart during the choosing and join your life with mine. That you'll make a life with me on Abu. Or—" A sigh shuddered out of him. He wrapped himself around her again, skin to skin, heart to heart, and threaded his fingers through her hair. "Here too, I guess. I don't care where we go, if you'll just be with me." "I will. I'll go with you, Gared." She murmured the words against his chest and allowed her smile to blossom into a full-fledged grin. "I love you, thief." "It's about time, woman." She laughed at his grumpy teasing. "Just promise me one thing." Anything.
Promise you'll never strand us in the jungle again.
And miss having you at my mercy?
He dropped a soft kiss on her forehead.
What about mountains on Abu? I know this place.
They teased each other for the rest of the afternoon, through a light meal and visitors drifting by to check on their well-being. In the end, though, it wasn't their words that bound them to each other. It was the love they'd found in the forgotten ruins, far away from the duties that had guided them each into the other's heart. The end. If you liked Thief of Hearts, read the next book in the series, The Choosing. This has been Thief of Hearts, a novella of the Pruxnae, written by Lucy Varna, narrated by Angel Clark. Copyright 2015 by C.D. Watson. Production copyright 2015 by C.D. Watson.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.